things on the. Oh, Deja, hello Deja. So we need to let Deja participate by phone. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Welcome Deja to the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, a couple things. One, I wanted to thank Jack for his resolution on the coronavirus, which we got out in record time.
We did.
And you're welcome.
Can I also mention a couple things on that? Yes. So I participated in a phone call this afternoon with the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, who is helping to coordinate some of the IT-related government issues on the coronavirus response. And they're going to be issuing a number of recommendations for agencies related to telework and access to databases and those types of things. On that call, I repeated some of the requests that were in the letter that Jack put together for us on educational programs, whether or not Okta would be able to help LEAs with that type of programming. And they directed me back to the DME's office, who's coordinating it for education agencies. So I did reach out to the DME's chief of staff this afternoon to ask those questions again, and then specifically to talk about the agencies, COOP plan, the continuity of operations plan, which all agencies have to have. Generally, anything that needs to go into that type of emergency planning, the sort of rule of thumb is if it cannot wait for 30 days, then it is essential. We don't have anything that can't wait for 30 days, other than the statutory requirement that we have to meet once a month. So that is the only thing that we have as this part of the agency that would not be able to meet within that 30 days. But there is potential for telework if we need to shut down the office for some reason. We all have laptops, so we do have the ability to access almost everything, which is just FYI.
Thank you. That's helpful. And thank you to Marcus for coordinating that with John Paul, the agency operations. I also want to thank my colleagues for improving the letter. I did not even think about meals and meal planning for students. Super important. I hope that we get a response from the DME because these are really critical things for our children. And it is not irrational to plan and prepare. And hopefully we won't have to face that, but we have time to get ahead of this, and the city has time to get ahead of it. And I really appreciate everyone's involvement.
Okay, second is in your folders is a appointments resolution which would relieve Emily of her appointment to the administrative committee and replace her with Zachary. So that's in there, which I guess we vote on next time. And then the other thing that I just wanted to raise now is I'm going to pass out to you. You know, we all have a lot of great testimony around dyslexia and reading in the fall, I guess into January. And we had talked about possibly doing a resolution or doing a letter, and that the timeline on the markup has just been such that that did not sort of work out. And I've been talking to various people about things we might say, and I have a draft that I want to pass out. It's a letter, it's a memo, really, and I know Emily's going to sign it. I believe Fraser's going to sign it. I think Zachary's looking at it, and so the question is, who wants to join into it? And we will just send it out and you can let that but these are the recommendations. So, did you get?
Could I mention one thing though?
Yeah.
Just from what Jack was saying, is I think that when we're sending out things, it might be better to vet it through the entire board so that people can read it and see if they see something that might need to be tweaked. Before you send it.
Well, consider this that. I mean, this can, if people want to sign it and change it, as with the coronavirus, they are welcome to say so. It's a problem, Fraser, because we're all in different places, and I tried to do a lot of that before sending it out. But
No, you've already sent this out?
no, I'm giving it to people right now. I'm
Okay.
working with other people who are particularly interested in reading.
think that we should be particularly interested in reading prior to. It's just too late. No, I mean, everything I write is wrong until I tweak it.
Right. Here, no, I'm passing them out right now. That's what I'm doing. That's,
You understand what I'm saying?
no. I mean, at any point that we pass something out, then people are gonna tweak it. There always has to be.
Okay, but what do you, okay, you passed it out, then what?
Do you want us to read it now? No, I want, if people are interested, they
What is
should
the
read it.
deadline?
Going out.
if you
I would like to send it tomorrow.
Move to.
And it can be from whoever wants to sign it. I talked to a number of people, I know a number of people are interested in it, I know, some people have concerns, so that's why I'm doing it this way.
You will recall that we did talk about this, I believe, at the last working session.
Yes.
And the discussion was whether or not to send a letter on behalf of the board. I think where Ruth landed, not to speak for you, but it seems like where she landed was just to send a letter, a general letter, not necessarily from the board, but whoever wants to sign on to it.
From board members.
From board members.
Now, I think, does everybody now have one? And I think the only person not here is Karen. Can you just send one to Karen?
Sure.
All right. Yeah, so, thank you, Zach is helping me. That's why he's sitting next to me. The context for the bill is, as you know, there was the big hearing around dyslexia in the early part of the fall. We had a set of meetings on it because so many people in the city are interested in it. And so the bill that was marked up initially by the Education Committee was very good, in my judgment, in many respects. It took up really all of the issues that have been raised. It was the idea that there should be screenings, the idea that teachers should have training, the idea that reading programs should be of the best quality and sort of reflect the best knowledge about teaching and reading. What it didn't do, and this is really the substance of what's in here, is it doesn't establish a standard for the quality. So the nature of the bill is it could be a half an hour of training would meet the requirements of the bill, or it could be a screening that wasn't widely recognized, or as I said, trainings that were half an hour or something. And so the idea of this is to encourage, when it goes to the committee of the whole, where it is sequentially referred, that they would put something in there that would add sort of a standard of quality. And I suggested as an example that the trainings, that the screening devices could get approved by something like the International Dyslexia Association, which provides that kind of certification. And there might be others as well. So
Because
that
the
is
alternative
gist of
would
it.
be what, potentially?
Well, that you don't know the
That the
quality
bill-
of it.
That the council then says, we ought to have training across the district and leaves it up to interpretation.
Yes.
Is that IC's interpretation or is that
Yes.
LEA's interpretation?
Well, I don't know how it will finally come out. I think different parts of it are in the hands of each of them.
And if it's not spelled out in the legislation, there's no guarantee.
Right. And also, yeah.
I mean, clearly there'll be a standard set, which is.
And also the idea is, and you can see it in the last one, is to have a high standard and have it funded, as opposed to don't have a standard and then everybody will do it for the cheapest that's possible, which isn't gonna solve the problem. It doesn't.
Can I ask a question which relates to concerns that I shared with Ruth when she shared some initial ideas about this with me as someone who's interested in reading. As we think about how council has the power to make change on education, one thing I've heard from a variety of stakeholders is concern over council getting too in the weeds with legislating education requirements that are typically left up to the purview of LEAs. So I'll go here to your note 7. Date by which every school must have a reading specialist or equivalent on staff. Right? There's real pushback right now in the public over librarians in DC Public Schools budgets being considered a flexible entity. This is essentially saying that now DCPS and every charter LEA must fund a position with a specific set of certification requirements, and must have it by some date certain. That feels like a very specific piece of thing to put in legislation for an entity that is not responsible for this specific LEA level budgeting, and makes complex, like, is this a good precedent to set? To ask council to get this specific in legislating educational interventions.
So, just to respond to that, this does not require, I think you said teachers be certified, I forget how you said it.
It says state by which every school must have a reading specialist, and my understanding is like that's a position with certain qualifications, people get education that makes them a reading specialist, degree or certificate.
I'm not sure that's the case,
So
that
right
is
there,
not so much what I meant. What I meant is what comes just before it, which is to say that there ought to be training that the training gets certified, not the person. That the training gets certified such that there's a training that makes you ready prepares you to teach a whole class early reading. There's a training that prepares you to be an interventionist for tier 2 or for tier 3, and a training that prepares you to be to do the screening. And that if you take those trainings, then you would be able to do these jobs. The point is, I take your point not to be over-prescriptive. The point here really is to say, at some point, we're saying this is not okay. It is not okay that our kids go to schools and they can't get diagnosed with what needs to get diagnosed early enough, and they can't get the intervention. So this is saying, by a date certain, there has to be people in that school who are capable of doing what needs to be done so that that child gets what they need.
That's what I guess I'm saying is I don't disagree with that at all. I'm saying I would expect to see something like this come out from OSSI in regulation, not for council to legislate. OSSI is the SEA, the state level responsibility for education
Right,
policy.
and part of what, and that may be a disagreement, I guess it is. I think it is up to the council to say the training needs to be at the top of the training needs to reach a standard that is acceptable to the folks who are the most involved in this and most up to date on the research on it. Because as we know, it is easy to put forward, especially in the reading field, which is so divided in some cases, proposals or professional development that wouldn't meet those standards. And I don't want to leave that to us, and I don't want to leave it to them to try to do something on the cheap. I want to say, look, we need to have the top level thing and then fund it.
So I have 2 points to this. Last working session, where we left it, I thought we were not going to give policy recommendations. I thought we were going to give to ASSI and the council what we heard from experts, because we are not experts.
It's 2 different things. We sent over a summary from the staff of all the people that we heard.
Okay.
And this is a letter from whatever board members want to send it.
Secondly, I have some concerns in us starting to become an activist organization. We are a policy board, and now we're weighing in on pieces of legislation, and it's concerning to me when we start to talk about funding, we start to talk about things that this board is not addressed to do. Like, we do not, it spells out what we do. It does not, if we want to bring forward policy recommendations, what would be good policy as you start to think about this legislation? Here are some recommendations, not saying this, we must have this number of training, we must have these certain certification for teachers, we must have this. These are all things that are not under the purview of this board. So I mean, obviously this is a letter that won't be sent by the board as a whole, so, but if we were able to reframe it, I would be more inclined to sign it. I'm not against several of these things, I'm just concerned as we start to become more activist.
So I'm open
And
if you have something to change it that sort of works. The one thing I would just say, I'm sorry, anyone, is we are
we're not an advocacy organization.
No, we're a
policy board.
policy group to put forward policy ideas, and what I would say is what this puts forward is policy ideas. There's nothing in here that says number of teachers or number of this or number of dollars. It says.
It does, well, it says though, I mean, you must have certified teachers, you must
It
have.
does not say anything about certified teachers. It does not. What it raises in number 4, and I can take that out, the question of whether or not you might want to create something so that as you hire new teachers, they know this stuff. And that's why it has a question mark. I mean, it's, you know, do we not, if we want to solve this, I mean, it's one thing to say we have all these people in the schools now, let's provide them with training, but in the longer run, might you not want to make it a one second?
No,
Oh, Emily.
Yes. There are two things. I am next.
I'm sorry, guys. I was trying to respond to that.
No,
Right, so the first thing I just wanted to say is that I was just happy to see that you had created a list of recommendations, because in my conversations with folks from including dyslexia and some other folks like Molly Whalen, they were concerned about the legislation being too big and that it wouldn't really end up being advantageous. And, you know, because, first of all, because if you don't specify that it should be funded, it won't be useful at all, right? But there were I don't remember the exact points, I would have to go back to my notes, but there were very specific points that they made that should be in the legislation that were not. So I think this is the right idea. And then just to Jessica's point, and also I think this might be relevant to the resolution that we'll discuss about Latinx teachers too. Would, for number 7, which you brought up, Jessica, you know, where it says that schools should be responsible for blah, blah, blah. Can we change it to OSSI? Can we say, you know, OSSI would create yeah, I mean,
Does that solve it?
So
Does
we're,
that
yeah, I
solve
mean,
that?
one thing I'm really curious about, the Chief Council of State School Officers is currently in the midst of a huge research project on literacy. And specifically, they're gathering all this information on various, and I say this because I have graduate students who are working with them on it, who are digging in on every piece of legislation that states have begun passing in the past 3 years on literacy. I'd be really curious, like, what level of detail are state legislatures, which is our council equivalent, getting into this versus to what level are they delegating to the SEA? Just because I think it absolutely makes sense to add additional detail to legislation, like requiring that it be funded. But I just want to get it, like, who calls the ball? Should we let the council call the ball on specific education interventions in their legislation, or should they delegate that to the agency whose job it is to do that?
So I will just, in response, and it's a policy question that people can agree or disagree on, is in our context, the only place where we or people in the city can go to say we want to make sure it has the standard of quality is in fact the council. OSSI doesn't function that way, and to your point, I did discuss this with the dyslexia folks, and they and I were agreed, it's very consistent, and they like it, so I would say that.
so you passed this by now. I did.
Why is this the first time I'm seeing this? Like, I had
Because
no
I-
idea.
Because I was going to send it on my own, and then I decided to show it to people, then I decided that I'd see who else wanted to sign it, and I actually did not necessarily intend for big discussion, although I'm very happy to have it insofar as
That
people
makes sense.
want to.
Got it.
It's-
No, and thank you for bringing it to everyone. I think it's super helpful. And I'm gonna disagree with actually a little bit. I think that for better or worse, we're wading into a lot of council policy discussions, and that's just a fact. But I think we're doing it in a haphazard manner, where we're accepting a single panel of folks at one of our public meetings, and then taking that curated list of witnesses and forming letters or policy statements or resolutions around that specifically deal with funding issues and with council legislation. I'd really like us to think about how we manage that better and have more intent behind it. And perhaps it's a committee, perhaps it's not. But I think if we're going to be doing this, I think three of the things on the agenda right now, from Empower Ed's resolution to this resolution on homelessness to this letter, those are all council policy / funding conversations. And I think we can be more deliberate, maybe have more impact if we build a better record of why we're weighing in on these things.
So I'll just say, we had like 3 hours worth of testimony on this. And this is pretty much all drawn from it. I would agree not 100% because there was a couple things that I don't even know what that I thought were good, but.
I think.
So anyway, we can have that conversation. I don't disagree.
Well, no, this came up in our last meeting, our last working session. That was my big concern about the letter that we sent over, because we're trying to make policy recommendations from 3 nonprofit advocacy organizations, and we didn't get a wide or broad swath of who we were just taking what they said for granted and passing, and then forming our policy recommendations from that small sampling. None of us were actually experts on the issue, and that is my concern moving forward as we start to move forward with many other issues. Like Jack just said, on several of the issues that we're taking up today, those are not issues that are within our purview, and they're just general education issues. And it's concerning to me that we're starting to make policy recommendations from a small sampling of advocacy organizations, or small sampling of activists.
Some of these letters just have to go fast, right? Like, I think.
Right, and we don't have the staff either to do.
I mean, we had only 2 staff members 7 years ago when I started, and board members just did more and more. So there is that option too. So I think we can make a greater impact if we're very deliberate on what we do, and have a process for vetting these things through.
Well, I'm happy to convene a group to sort of talk about different ways of doing this over the long run.
Okay.
I totally do not disagree about being a bit more deliberate. I'm now wondering if this is even appropriate for us to talk about it if it's not a state board issued letter versus like a one-off letter. That's an open question. But I think it's also important context. You remember at the last meeting, I was very uneasy about issuing a letter unless we were invited to do so for very, very similar reasons. I did hear from Ruth that invitation did come from the chairman's staff. But yes, we would love your recommendations, which is in part reason why maybe I don't love every wording of this. I would be fine with issuing them, but I do agree we could stand to be a bit more deliberate. If I could also, if we're just taking wording recommendations, or do you want to do that
I
another
mean, if
time
it's just wording, you can just do it.
afterwards? Okay.
And I'm going to say, if there's sort of policy things that are on a modest end, as opposed to we can't weigh in on policy, I'm totally open to that too. And I just want to say, I hear what everybody's saying. I was trying to do this, frankly, in a way that wouldn't draw on a lot of staff and that wouldn't take a lot of time. So it's really bad planning. But
But I guess I'm trying to think about what it would look like, what you're saying, because, I mean, for instance, the resolution that I'm presenting tonight is taken directly from what I'm hearing in my ward. You know what I mean? And I didn't think that was kind of part of our responsibility, right? To bring what we're hearing in our wards to our colleagues and then to decide whether or not we're yeah. So I'm just saying, I guess, in terms. So what does more deliberate look like then? I guess I thought that our working meetings were a place where we vet those kinds of things. You know what I mean? And you might say, well, actually, since this is mainly a Ward 1 issue, you should be the one to kind of just do your own advocacy on that. And we would have that discussion. So I guess you could just respond.
Usually when legislative bodies work, they create a record of why they're doing the work that they're doing. It's very rare that a legislator will So I think having deliberate sort of roundtable discussions with community members, I think having a public discussion about the issue where we're not just talking to each other and we're not just relying on you, Emily, to have said, well, I talk to people and so this is important. Those are different things.
But you have to start somewhere, right? Like, I mean,
I'm not saying we don't.
Didn't we start with the things that we've done in the last 3 months with our public meetings? It seems to me
Yes,
that
but
we did.
the critique is that that's not the full picture. We only heard.
Well,
from
and
this.
if we just do what's good.
I guess that what I'm leading up to is we're never going to get the full picture. And if it's something immediate, like vaping, sort of became immediate, right? And we had testimony. It was it was all over the news and stuff like that. But and we acted on it. But is that do we spend enough time before we acted on it for that particular issue? Maybe not.
If you think of the council before they pass legislation, they have hearings, and so that would be their deliberate process to hear.
No, I understand that, but our hearings are really our public meetings. I mean, that's.
It could be, but it doesn't have to.
No, I'm saying that's what they are. That's what we
So
do.
to this example, let's say you brought this, then our charge as a board could be, let's have roundtables, maybe in Ward 1, to just hear more, to kind of get more credence to the arguments.
And I'd also suggest that if we're only
I'm not saying-
working from testimony that we get at our monthly meetings, those monthly meetings can get really long, and do we have to have 3 or 4 panels, or sometimes would a panel get cut? And I think a committee on what council legislation is doing, one, could inform the full board on a monthly basis what the council is doing around education legislation and funding. And 2, the committee could be a little more nimble than, I think we plan out our meetings a couple months in advance, and a committee could be more nimble than that, but still get public input and have roundtable discussions in a way that's super inclusive.
Yeah, I'm not. I agree with what you said, Jack. I just think that we need to set up a structure.
I'm great. We're in
And
agreement.
I think that should be on the agenda for our next working session. Because somebody can come in with an idea. Okay, Ashley comes in with an idea at our working session, and then we talk about it and see what we can do.
Yeah, I mean,
way over.
That's generally.
I think there's certainly room for that in both scenarios that were sort of laid out. I mean, I think the reason we added the new business portion to the agenda was also to talk about things that are from that you're learning in your wards, or from around the city, or from school visits, or from all of those things, right? So there's a purpose. I mean, we didn't always have those, right? So that's reflecting, I think, some of that discussion too. And I think there is certainly other state boards that have like intergovernmental committees or things, or have that type of work. In other places, the staff does some of that work, and that's reflected also by the work we're already doing. By we send out all of the information for the DC Register, which is every council action on anything related to education is sent out weekly to board members. So if you're not using that, or if it's not being helpful, and the format of it needs to change to make it more helpful, we can certainly talk about that as well. So I think there's a number of different things in terms of format, process questions that certainly can be discussed as well. There are other precedents for like agenda setting committees or separate meetings of the board to do agenda setting. That's generally not how our bylaws have operate, so we would need to consider that kind of change as well if we were talking about something broader. But I think all of these questions are good process ones that I think they are led from all of the things that have been changing from the board for the past 10 years, right? We were established as a different type of agency that we have evolved into, and I think this is a normal type process of doing that type of evolution. So maybe that was my 2 cents.
Just Marcus and Jessica.
I just say, I think, for sure, I think it's important to underscore again that for some issues, right, the passage of a resolution or a beginning of the conversation from this body is not necessarily the end of a conversation, but the beginning, right? I mean, in terms of, right, getting the full context on every issue, right, if we had waited to pass a resolution saying that teacher turnover was a problem before we had the full context, we still wouldn't have a resolution passed, right, underscoring that teacher turnover is an issue in the city. And while I think it's important to get a diverse group of voices at the table to make sure that we have a full context on a lot of these issues, I also don't want us as a body to sell ourselves short on the level of expertise we bring to the table, and we were all elected for a reason, right? And that the things that in the conversations that are happening in our communities, right, are informed discussions, and we also shouldn't necessarily sell those conversations short either. I also think it's important to also understand that a lot of issues that are important to our constituents, right? There's just not going to be a clean what's inbounds for us and what's not, and I think that we should be perfectly comfortable case by case discussing what we feel is inbounds and what's not, and really allowing us as colleagues to feel as free as possible to bring those discussions to the group and have them. And I think that's important. That we also shouldn't, I think, pass the buck or try to create layers of process over process just because we're afraid to tell each other that we think addressing one issue or another is a bad idea, right? We should feel free to have those open discussions and figure it out. And then where we can't necessarily come to, right, a clean consensus, right, there's always outs that folks can sign on to a letter, right, without it being passed by the floor, or we can vote and just decide that something's a good idea or not. And so I just wanted to caution us that on topic after topic, we're really spinning our wheels trying to find a clean process for everything, while knowing that the way we govern our education system is probably functionally unclean. And so, and I don't mean to say that as an insult, but everything's not cut and dry, and we shouldn't expect it to be in this space. But we should also feel comfortable enough with one another to really just have those discussions and decide on a case by case instead of building layers of process over process just because we're afraid to have a discussion.
I'm not afraid to have any discussions. I just feel like this is a little scattershot. We can be more deliberate.
My comment was very specific. Given this letter, no matter who you're going to get to sign on to it, I hope that you'll also run it by the Ombudsman's office, because the interventions you're talking about here are the very specific things in one of their annual report recommendations around an RTI warehouse. And I do wonder whether they might have something to say that could either add to this, or at least that we could offer some support to the important work they've put in their annual report recommendations.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So maybe add them to this letter if they want.
I don't think they like to.
I was gonna say ask them, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
If they want to. Give them the opportunity.
Anybody else on this? And then I have a.
I just last thing I would just say here. I want to delineate the two arguments I'm hearing. One, I think, is a very valid one around like being more deliberative around more substantive topics, which I connect to the issues that we're issuing letters or policy recommendations. You can argue like the Save Met letter. While we didn't have a robust discussion around it, we did have a panel, and it was part of the public dialogue, and so there was a lot of input there. And so while I'm not necessarily saying let's put this on pause while we do that, I do think there could be benefit for more substantive policy-related issues that we have a more deliberative process. While a resolution, I don't think we need to have panels, for instance, on that in order to pass a resolution. So just delineating those, because I don't want, or at least for me, my opinion is not that we should have a 3-month process to get anything.
So the only thing I want to say is I very much agree with what Marcus said. What I was going to say is I'm totally open to having a discussion, either at the next working meeting or separately, about a process to deal with this. But the two caveats I would say is, one, I don't want us to become super absorbed in being legislative people. other things that we mainly want to do. And along with that, I really don't want to create a lot of staff time around this. I mean, I really think we want to put our staff time to the projects that we're involved with as a board, some of the research stuff we're doing, and so on and so on. So, but it's true that we're raising things. I don't want to stop raising them. Sometimes we want to push them forward, sometimes not. So if there's a usefulness in having a further discussion on it, whether it's offline or here, I'm happy to do it. And I guess it's good that we have this conversation, so I'm glad I passed this out. I mean, what I would say is normally I would just think, had I planned to have this, I would have sent it out earlier, which is typically what we've done. And maybe that's the big problem, because otherwise I do think as to what's in here, we heard from experts, there's a lot of expertise on this board, and people can find out more, talk to their constituents about it.
Can I just say for the record, I don't perceive the issues that we have addressed to be scattershot. I think we've responded to, or for the most part, responded to issues that have been percolating already, either in our boards or in our city or nationwide, right? And I think dyslexia is certainly one of them that I've been hearing about all year. So I don't know. I guess, yeah.
For the I would disagree. I think they've been a little reactionary over the past year, and it's no, and to the point where because there's a piece of legislation we're doing, I'm just a little concerned in the direction that we continue to go. I would be willing to, if the letter could be framed to say we have heard from the following organizations, and these are, from those discussions, these are recommendations that were discussed.
Per your request.
Per your request, right, exactly. I would be, if we could reframe things in that manner, the same way we did with the coronavirus letter. We reframed it to say, how are you thinking about this? Not, do this. Because, we're not that body, but if we were able to just, I guess, maybe soften it or reframe it in a way that makes people say, hey, we are helping you out, okay, but we're not the experts. We aren't making policy.
So let me offer this just as a middle ground between those two things in terms of the sort of reactionary or more planned out. I think this is great, and I think that this helps on a number of issues that I think we've all talked about. So reading and reading instruction, and the science of reading and how important that is, and then also this issue of dyslexia. But it sort of intersects two worlds, right? There's this notion of this could help with early literacy, this could help with families who are struggling to get their students properly identified as having a reading disability. But the city right now is doing a ton of work on special education, right? Our students with special ed needs lag behind in both sectors, in every grade level, all across the city. And our students who are low income or categorized as at risk, who are also students with disabilities, lag even further behind. And OSSI just put out a framework for special education. Our Ombudsman's office has a whole list of recommendations, many of which focus on special education. If we were being a little bit more planful, I think we would tackle this as piece of a larger set of conversations around the issue of special education. But because we had folks come talk to us about dyslexia, and because there's a bill about dyslexia, we've chosen to sort of pick out this one slice. And to me, that's the possibility of going between the two, of saying not just react to who comes to us and who comes up, but to think about, like, how do we affect system-wide, statewide, as a state board, the kind of change our kids need?
I actually have asked that question to some folks, both parents who have kids with dyslexia and other learning disabilities, and both of them have responded about the dyslexia stuff, because I was surprised by that too, like, why just focus on dyslexia? But apparently this is something concrete we can do. And the special education issues are so big, and they're, the bigger problem is that it's unfunded, right? Like that we don't
Oh, special ed is funded.
I know, but what I'm saying is we don't get enough money from the federal government to fully do what we should be doing to meet.
Yeah. No state does. They never will.
No, I
And it
know.
wasn't designed that way.
Right. So it's a huge problem, and I think that this is a very specific problem that actually there are strategies that have been identified that are effective, and we could be doing them. And so that was my understanding of why it happened. And so it made sense to me on that level. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, I had that question too. So that's why I was like, oh, okay. And also just the fact that now we know the number of kids who probably have dyslexia, right? Like who grew up and didn't realize that was the issue. That it's probably 10%, something like that. I think makes it worth addressing as an issue. So
I think it's just about two different theories of action of how our board should address policy issues. It's not about dyslexia not being important. It's about should we do the low-hanging fruit that comes before us because someone says, hey, please pay attention, or do we say, what's our highest leverage for our energy, our work, and maybe it's doing one piece of this high leverage work at a time. So like this is the first thing, and then what's the next thing, and what's the next thing.
So maybe it's acknowledging that. Because I would say that it's, for me, I didn't understand it as like we are picking this low hanging fruit. It was a more deliberate, like, this is a piece of a larger problem that we are addressing because it's actually something that we could address. You know, we actually could solve this problem. Whereas I think the larger problem with special ed not being done well in our system is a much bigger problem. You know, that maybe doesn't have such easily, you know, the issues aren't as easily addressed.
I'm gonna say one comment and then Marcus. I mean, to Jessica's point, look, there's always a question of grain size, no matter what you're talking about. You can go big, you can go little, you can go medium, you can make some mix of, you know, do it in a responsive way or start from the beginning. And I don't really think we're gonna ever get a full handle on that. I think we did try to have a very deliberate, planful way of sort of taking on a set of research, but I don't think we can do that. I wouldn't be for doing that around legislation per se. But we can take, you know, as things come up that are worth doing, in that kind of way, we should. But I don't think that we need a full policy on it. Sometimes we'll want to do things that are more granular. Sometimes we want to do things that are bigger. Sometimes they'll be responsive. Sometimes they'll be more planful. I think the way to play that out is you're in our discussions.
I don't think it's about grain size. I think it's opportunistic versus strategic. And I'm always going to be on the side of strategic. It's fine if that's not the board's perspective, but I'm always going to bring that to the table. That I think we should be strategic rather than opportunistic.
And I will say that often the most strategic way to move forward is to be opportunistic, especially when you're in the position that we're in. And that's sort of how I think about it. Just so you know, I think it is strategic to sort of pick as things come up and there's things that we can have an input on.
That's the next step.
But Marcus and then Zachary. And then I'm taking this now as just a conversation on this broader question, and that's why I'm sort of entertaining it when it comes.
Well, I'll just say I think that there are many people who sent us here because of their sheer frustration with bringing up an issue that seems important, and then having folks in the position of authority lump it into other things that slow down addressing the main thing that they were talking about, right? Now, do I think, you know, the state board should be addressing, right, not having, right, a librarian at Martin Luther King Elementary? Absolutely not. But do I think, right, the type, you know, weighing in on the type of supports that 1 in 10 of our students, right, on an issue that 1 in 10 of our students in the city faces, right, I think meets a threshold that's worthy of the discussion and worthy of action on our behalf? Absolutely. And so, you know, I'm all about, for sure, being deliberate and planning to the extent that we can, but not necessarily ignoring the real conversations that are happening on very tangible issues in our community for the sake of looking organized, right? And for sure, we want to address these in ways that make the most sense, but we also want to address them in ways that are so, while I'm sure people who have decided not to take action on these issues for decades would love to see us, right, lump this conversation into a broader conversation because that's what they've been doing for a decade, right? For sure, those folks will be much nicer about our approach. But sometimes, right, when we're the only folks in this space who were elected, right, to raise issues from the grassroots and actually, right, drive action on those things. I think, style is important, but so is actually, right, moving the conversation in a direction that's going to be more productive for the folks that we represent. So, again, for sure we're not always going to agree on kind of what that looks like in reality, but I do want to also caution against the notion that looking good, right, cannot take precedent over doing good.
That was pretty good.
I can't trump that. I just wanted us to name what our next steps are. And if I could offer or recommend, rather than instead of us having another debate around this at the next working session, that perhaps board members, not to volunteer Ashley and Jack, but board members who may see a path forward for being more deliberative, which I would agree with, can maybe bring something to the table that we can react to. I just think that might be more productive than
I agree.
the circular conversations.
Or does it make sense to do it offline, like that, to sort of do it?
Well, that's a state board issue, so we
Why
would have.
why don't I just draft a document with Ashley and we can email it around, and if it warrants further conversation, then
Sounds good.
good suggestion.
All right, thank you, everybody, and I'm sorry I let it go on too long, but it was interesting
Where
to
is
have
this?
it in.
Where was this coming from?
Well, it's on the leadership report. Anyway, anybody who wants to either sign it to tell me, or if you have sort of modest fixes, I would be more than happy to deal with them as well, but in the very short term. Okay, executive director's report.
Hello. So I wanted to update the board on the hiring process for our new policy analyst. We received over 200 applications for the position. I was able to whittle them down to a smaller number, under 15, to do phone interviews with, and then those are going to proceed over the next half week or so. And I'm hopeful by next Wednesday that we have a narrowed list to invite for additional screenings, whether that's probably a writing sample and an in-person interview. My hope is that we can have someone identified by the end of the month, and then likely then start sometime in mid-April. I do also want to note specifically that our budget hearing is coming up on March 23rd, on Monday, March 23rd, which is 2 days after the budget is released on March 19th. We should be getting from the council, they alerted us that they will be sending us our budget questions this week, and that they will be due probably before or immediately after the budget is released, including our public testimony, which is due 48 hours in advance of our hearing, which would be the 19th. So it is going to be a very busy couple weeks. So please be patient with me and with Serena and Dan and the rest of the staff. There's a lot that we're going to have to push in this next week and a half. And it is going to be a lot to try to get through all of the things that we have to do. So please do just be patient with us while we get through this. As with practice in the performance oversight hearing, and has been for years, I will be sharing the draft of the testimony and of the questions as early as I possibly can with board members, so that you have a chance to look at them prior to them going to the council. But also recognize that there are, council deadlines, and so the review window will likely be shorter than what it has been in the past, just so that we can comply with those rules. I also want to update the board on the funding that the council provided in this fiscal year for the old council chambers. We do have, the DGS has funding to do some renovations in there, largely for new microphones and speakers and technology type things. We are still hopeful that will be done prior to May, because that's when the old council chambers will no longer be available to us because of the primary. So I don't know, frankly, at this moment, whether or not that's going to happen. DGS has not been able to commit to that date. I am in contact with the Council Committee on Facilities and Procurement, who were the ones who identified the funding for us, and they are aware of the challenges that we've had as well. So,
I recall at the oversight hearing, Councilmember White said he and team, and they did follow up, but the follow up was
I am still working with them on all of those things. But yes, Councilmember White has been very helpful, and his staff.
Question.
Sure.
The table that people testify on
Yes.
is the worst looking table.
That is part of the discussion as well.
I would agree. It's chip.
Because we don't, it's really embarrassing. It's not,
From our side,
Everything that has been discussed in previous meetings has been
no, it's on TV, that's why I was.
everything that has been discussed through previous iterations of the board for years has been discussed, and I believe we have enough funding to do this. There is an additional thing that I would like to mention to the board. I don't have anything solid to present, but I have also been in conversations with the DCPS art programs, as well as the Commission on Arts and Humanities. As you know, Councilmember Grasso has been sponsoring an art program for the past, maybe since the first day he was on the council, I don't know. But he provided the ability for the students to have a display space at the Wilson Building, which it has not yet been taken up by any council members that I know. But so I have talked to them about the potential of maybe hosting that student art in the old council chambers. It would require us moving some of the murals that are in there to the higher parts of the wall so that we can have the student art at the lower part. But I thought it would be a really nice thing to be able to have some student art be featured in that space. The other part that I spoke with DCPS and with the Commission on Arts and Humanities is about maybe hosting an art contest to help raise the profile of student artists in DC through, I don't know, this is not my bailiwick, but Commission on Arts and Humanities in the 90s and through the early 2000s used to purchase student art and have it as part of the DC art collection. They stopped doing that at some point, and I don't know exactly when or why or how. It probably had something to do with funding. But if there is interest from the board, I'm willing to have some conversations with the commission about partnering with the state board, the Commission on Arts and Humanities, and potentially some other agencies or outside firms to help promote some sort of contest like this, to help also raise funds for art teachers.
You know, Elizabeth Holmes Norton, she hosts an art competition every year as well.
She does.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've been the past couple of years, and that gathers a ton of entries. We might want to consider just the winners. Well, the winners are featured in the Capitol, but for those who don't win, featuring some of the other contestants.
Yeah.
It's great, great entries.
Yeah, I agree. And that was the other part too about having potentially some of the.
I love this idea. I've got, I think, 3 or 4 different pieces of student art that I bought at my school auctions.
Yeah. So that was my initial thinking is how do we encourage these types of programs? And when I was speaking with some of the people at DCPS and Commission on Arts and Humanities, they indicated that they thought sort of a encouragement for our teachers to participate in the program would be funding for them their classrooms to in the range of $5,000 or $10,000 to be able to revamp all of the art supplies for their classrooms. It would be something that would be really interesting. Again, this is all very speculative. Who knows? No decisions have been made, but I did want to raise it as a potential as we move forward through this year.
And sorry, I was just going to say GCPL is another partner. They used to not sure who to reach out to, but
Yeah.
that's.
And we have in the state board offices and the Ombudsman and Student Advocate's office some student art as well. It's one of the things that I asked for when we were selecting art from the collection.
I would just say for me, I think the idea of having art from students is interesting. I'm very worried, it gets back to sort of the staff allocation question. I'm very worried about us taking on sort of a big contest or anything like that.
That's
So my
great-
proposal
Great
is
point.
that you think about this and you come back to us with
When
the best possible
I
ideas.
spoke with the commission, they indicated that they actually anticipate receiving additional staff people that could do all of the logistics for this. It would be more of, on our side, a leading sponsor type activity rather than coordinating big things. Because I'm certainly not going to be a judge for an art contest. I don't know any of that. So anyway, that's my report.
I started calling this the departed teacher survey, but now it sounds dramatic. It sounds morbid. Thank you, Michael. That's the word I was looking for. But Fraser, are you going to take us into that, or Alex, or whoever?
Alex had plenty of time to warm up since it was but I guess, it's been done, and the results are coming to you as we speak. And the results are very interesting. And
It's
gives
not
us a lot of room to work with.
I can sit here.
All right, Alex.
Yeah, what I'm doing.
I'm gonna say.
Everybody got one here?
The-
Yeah, it's on the back, that's it.
yeah, that's okay.
It's not showing the face. There. It's just slow.
Were you
All right, I'm gonna sit, just because I don't want to stand. But if you can't hear me, let me know. So, I'm gonna quickly go over some of the results from the report that we received from the teacher attrition survey. So, just some background: we contracted with a vendor to administer our survey. The final report was delivered on Friday, so last Friday. The teacher retention committee met on Monday to discuss the report briefly, kind of outline some potential recommendations, and now it's being brought to the full board to kind of discuss and share. So the presentation I'm going to go through, it's very short, kind of pulls out some of the high-level takeaways that I find to be very interesting, that I think the teacher retention committee found to be very interesting, kind of some of the methodology that was done behind it, kind of the sample size, just so people are familiar with that, and kind of what some of the proposed recommendations might look like coming out of this report. In addition to the slides that were provided to you, in the folder there should be a cover memo or cover letter that we anticipate, with a big draft stamped across it, that we anticipate transmitting with the report and any other kind of response letters that we might receive from agencies or stakeholders. And so that's just kind of the background and the items that you should have in your folder. So, just for context and the methodology, so our vendor, when he was given the survey itself was 72 questions, 10 sections each. It took, I think, most individuals about 10 to 12 minutes to complete. It was administered for a 3-week period from December 20th through January 17th. Most respondents replied via text messages, but it was transmitted via email and text messages to a distribution list of just over 2,000 teachers. Many of you are very aware with how we work to procure those names. We don't need to go into details about that, but we were able to procure the contact information for just over 2,000 exited teachers. There were 2 charter schools that self-administered the administration. They weren't comfortable with transmitting the personal information, but they did send out the surveys on their own. So there was a survey component of the report. There was also a focus group component of the report. So after individuals completed the survey, they had the opportunity to opt in to possible focus groups. There were, I think, 95 people or so that wanted to participate in the focus groups. The vendor worked to create a representative sample, and there were 22 participants that participated in the focus groups across 3 sessions. Each had anywhere from 8 to 9 people in it, I think. And then in addition to that, there were follow-up interviews that were done. So individuals could choose to opt into focus groups, but they could also opt in for follow-up interviews. I think about 100 or so people also opted in to do that. And so 13 additional participants who had not previously participated in a focus group participated, I think, in anywhere from like a 45-minute to an hour video interview. The focus groups were about 2.5 hours each. I think 2 of them went over on time, and the third did end right on time because there was another commitment for the vendor after that. So that's just a quick overview of the methodology and kind of what went into gathering this information. Any clarifying questions on that? Okay. So the survey sample size, or the survey sample. So as I indicated, the survey was sent to just over 2,000 individuals. We procured those names from 7 charter schools, 5 of whom gave us the information, 2 of whom sent out the survey on their own. And then we had 1 additional partner that helped provide us additional contact information for teachers who are in the traditional public school sector. The response rate at maximum would be about 11.8%, and that is because we do not know the total number of surveys that were actually distributed to across those 2 other schools that sent them out on their own, and what the response rate actually looks like at those schools, if that makes sense. So the total N size for the survey, when all was said and done, was 242. So it's 242 teachers who responded to our survey. And you'll notice on the slide kind of a quick breakdown of kind of some of the interesting facts about that sample size. 1/3 of them had under 5 years of experience. 70% of them had under 10 years of experience. 1/3 of them were alternatively certified. Another 1/3 of them traditionally certified. I think it was 60 to about 60-40 when it came down to the breakdown of traditional public schools to public charter schools. 77% female, 28% male, and then you'll see the breakdown for Black, White, and Latinx. Some interesting notes are the female-male breakdown was actually nearly identical to the TNTP OSCE workforce report, as were some of the demographic breakdowns. So I thought that was actually carried some significant weight for us, the fact that the OSCE report, though, had a much larger and robust sample size, was still pretty represented in ours as well, even though smaller. So, yeah, go ahead.
Clarifying question about the, you said the approximate, there were about 2,000 possible teachers that this would have gone out to. Is that sort of the maximum? That's how many teachers we know have exited about?
No, so that is the number of teachers that we sent the survey to.
So you did send out.
So we sent a survey, or the vendor sent a survey out to just over 2,000 exited teachers, and so that would be teachers who've exited over the past 2 academic school years. Of those, only 242 responded to the survey.
So why is the response rate approximate? Say that again.
So it's approximate because we do not know how many surveys the 2 charter schools who self-administered sent their, how many were on their list,
So it's a small.
and also how many of their list actually responded to.
Okay.
So
That would be
It would be really small.
exactly, and so basically, it's not going to. Yeah, the 11.8% is basically 242 divided by 2,000,
Gotcha.
because it would only go down. The rate can only really go down.
I think you can just.
So yeah, so that's the. That's that.
Thank you.
All right. So to the key findings, I think there are 2. Yeah, there are 2 slides here. So I think I bulleted this into kind of 7 key findings. The report itself is very lengthy. I think it's like 142 pages. There's a lot of information in there. The vendor did provide us with all of the raw unidentifiable data, so we're able to kind of go back and kind of do some of our own analysis. I have not done any of that yet, but I think it is very exciting that we do have that. So, top major factors. And so when we said major factors, this is individuals were asked, what is the major reason why you decided to depart? If you resigned or quit, what was your major reason for leaving? And you'll notice that, so work climate and culture, external or personal factors, roles and responsibilities, teacher evaluation systems were all the top responses. One thing to note is that respondents were able to choose more than one. And so this is not going to add up to 100%. Someone could have chosen all 4 of those, or someone could have chosen 2 or just 1. But all of them, you see in the mid to upper 30s, people are stating these as being major factors. Teacher evaluations. DC public school teachers cited impact as the primary reason they chose to leave the classroom. And so when the vendor separated both the charter school teachers and the public school teachers and looked at major factors, DCPS teachers chose teacher evaluation as their primary major factor for exiting. That was followed by personnel reasons, and then I believe, I'm going to look at it so I don't mistake it. It was, I think, yeah, but I just don't want to say that. Yeah, so that was followed by external personal factors, that was at 16%, and then climate and culture, that was at 14%. But they still stated that teacher eval was the #1 reason for their departure. Interestingly enough, there were charter school teachers who also cited teacher evaluation systems as being subjective and perfect, etc. Whether or not they knew people that had experience with the DCPS system or some sort of evaluation system in their own LEA. Other key findings, teacher safety and mental health was something that really came up, especially I think in the focus groups, about the safety of teachers, but also the students and kind of what can be done around mental health supports for both groups. School leadership was very much talked about, I think, in the focus groups and in the follow-up interviews. Really kind of being unsupported by school administration, strained relationships, the tensions that they're experiencing between school level leadership and then being teachers.
Guys, quick question.
Yes, Marcus.
Was it asked on the survey, and if so, do we have a breakdown of teachers who quit versus teachers who were fired for some reason? And then also, were there any demographic reports on whether teachers just left the district or left the profession altogether?
Yes, we have responses to both those questions.
Whether teachers left from one sector to the other.
So we do have some information on whether or not, if you left your school, if you went into another sector, yes, or if you left the school and you went to like PG County.
If you went from, say, DCPS to charter or to St. Catholic,
yes,
or another private entity.
Yes, we have that information. And so we'll note all these questions, and I think there's a lot of information, a lot of data. Obviously, we can't share it all, but we do have answers to all these questions.
And we'll go into sort of a Q&A that's then available both to us and the media. How are we going to do that?
We can talk about, yeah, we can. Factors related to exit, and attitudes related to teaching. I just thought that these were really interesting tidbits to share. So most public school teachers, this is traditional and charter, exited the classroom originally earlier than they had originally planned. And so you'll see over 80% of respondents spent less than 1 year contemplating their departure. So people are, usually something's happening that year and they decide to leave. And this next one is really alarming. 1/3 of respondents indicated that school leadership did not encourage them to stay once they made it known that they would leave. And so what that means is that teachers are approaching their school leaders and saying, I'm thinking about leaving, and they're not saying, oh, please stay. Like, what can we do to help you? Which is, personally saddened to hear. Attitudes related to the teaching job. Again, I think these are very interesting. Over 86% of respondents indicated that they were passionate about teaching, but that they just did not receive adequate support that they needed, whether it was from their school or the LEA. And so we're talking about people who want to be teachers and want to be in the classroom, and just not having the support to do the job that they wanted to do. I know one of the hypotheses that we wanted to test was this idea of whether or not people were becoming teachers kind of springboard into something else. The vendor kind of rejected that hypothesis. Like, that's not the case. Or, are we living in a city that's just more transient with more millennials that are popping in and out? Kind of rejected. It was largely shown that most of these people were very passionate about being teachers, wanting to be in the classroom, and just were not being supported in the appropriate ways, whether it was leadership or having resources to make them stay. And so the next two slides kind of talk through kind of the 7 hypotheses that when the stakeholder groups met and when the teacher retention group met, kind of different things that we really wanted the vendor to probe. And so the vendor did probe these kind of 7 things. The one is on the district being more transient with millennials. As I indicated, that was largely rejected by the vendor, or that hypothesis was. Folks using teaching as a springboard to get into other types of roles, that was also rejected by the vendor. Teachers liking impact in the current teacher evaluation system. The vendor failed to reject this hypothesis for a variety of reasons, and so there were some individuals who did indicate that they did like the incentive-based structure of impact and the fact that there are opportunities to earn more money. But there were, a lot of individuals, especially through their focus groups, who indicated that impact was not working for them, etc. So there's still a lot of questions to be asked on that one.
Can I raise just one thing on this, just as background? The hypotheses, just so people understand, these were really developed and checked with stakeholders. The idea was that everybody's best idea about sort of why there was so much turnover would be probed. The idea was, we'll see what happens, was that having had that tested, everybody could now sort of come to the table and say, okay, we tried that, we looked at that, what was the idea?
When, did we say impact specifically, or did we use a teacher evaluation system? So our teachers that have departed, are they specific to impact, or are they not liking any teacher evaluation system?
So the survey itself, I know it references, teacher evaluation systems,
Okay.
and then it did example impact as being one. But for this particular hypothesis, we wanted to know if it was explicitly impact that was something that teachers did like or not.
Okay, because we hear time and again, teachers don't like impact, but principals do. I've had numerous conversations around this, and I mean that. I just can't. I think that there will, no matter what, whether you have a hypothesis, no matter what evaluation system we have, there will be teachers who do not like the evaluation system.
Can I just ask why
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
worded the way it is? Number 3, because the other 2 are hypotheses about why teachers would leave, and the third one seems like the opposite. Right? Like, was it worded like that on purpose to...
Say that again, I'm sorry.
So the third one says teachers like impact, but I
So-
thought the hypothesis would be they leave because they don't like impact.
So again, to what Ruth was saying, is these hypotheses are not necessarily just ones that we as the state board may have brought forward, but there were some stakeholders that genuinely are saying that yes, teachers like impact and they like it for these reasons.
But that's not why they would leave. These are hypotheses about why they leave, right?
Not necessarily like testing them as a whole, for teachers in general. But I do see what you're saying. Yes.
So
Yeah.
sort of like a
It is.
hypothesis.
It is. Yeah. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Other ones, teachers enjoyed teaching at DCPS, but they felt impact disproportionately, favors particular teachers or schools based on populations. That hypothesis was rejected. Most teachers are departing for personal reasons. That was rejected. Though personal reasons were one of the major factors, it was not the highest reason. And then numbers 6 and 7 both were failed to be rejected. 6 largely because we don't have, access to teacher ratings, and so all of our teachers self-reported their rating, and so we can't really make a appropriate judgment on that. And then number 7, yes, it was recognized that teachers are feeling unprepared and overwhelmed, but it was not one of the highest reasons. It was up there, but it was not the top one.
These are the hypotheses we tested?
Yes. And so in the report, I think there are 2 sections. One towards the front that is more of a summary piece of this. This is like the full report. And then one in the later end of the report that actually, where I think he breaks it down based across like the survey part, the focus group part, and the interview part. You do not have a physical copy of the report. Again, it's 140 pages, so we do not print it, but I do believe John Paul shared it electronically. And so lastly, just coming out of the meeting that happened on Monday with the Teacher Retention Committee, these I think were the recommendations that were discussed as far as next steps as we think about this report and kind of some of its findings. And those are more laid out and better articulated in the cover memo. And so we have 1, the adoption of the Statewide Educational Data Warehouse Amendment Act, and that's a piece of legislation that was put before council. 2, developing mentoring programs for teachers. 3, utilizing the findings of this report and this research to really think about DCPS's redesign of impact. We know that Chancellor Farabee has talked about it, but really using this report and its findings to help guide that work. And then 4 and 5 really touch on the school culture piece, and 5 more specifically on identifying ways for school level leadership to really support the improvement of that school culture and climate. And so we'll end there, and I'll take any quick questions that we might have as we kind of talk through this. But I think this point of the period, part of the meeting was to use to talk through the report, kind of any big questions you had. I know Marcus and Ashley raised the specific data questions, and I think if any of you have specific data questions, we can look in and I can send you what it is, or talk about it. So I don't know if you want me, Ruth, to pick up, or if you want to.
So I thank you very much for this. First of all, it's a great summary, and taking a 142-page research report and getting it down to a couple slides and a couple-page memo is no small thing. So thank you for that.
And also thank you to Caitlin too for her work on this.
Thank you for that. My question is, I have not. I don't recall the TNTP OSSE report as well. Do they have recommendations at the end of theirs, or is it just data?
I don't recall either. But I think we could find that out very easily.
The following on question was, if they have recommendations, it might be nice to lay those out side by side, either for us or in here, so that we can offer what we're building on. Because I like that you pointed out the demographic similarities. If there are other things, other findings that are similar, or recommendations that are similar, I think it helps that this is an additive report to that one.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I was just curious on number 4, culture. That's a big one, right?
It is,
and,
yeah.
And kind of can mean a lot of different things.
Absolutely.
So I was just curious, and I haven't had a chance to look at the report yet. First of all, did teachers name very specific things that, were there commonalities across what they were saying enough to be able to say, oh, these are some points around culture that we would be able to make specific recommendations for, or was it kind of a self-place, or was it just really vague?
So there's definitely a lot there. One of the great things about the report is that there is an appendix where there's responses to all the open-ended questions for all the respondents, and it outlines a series of things related to culture and climate, but it is varying. I think one of the things that we can point to, and I don't have, can you pass me the draft? I think so for work climate and culture, I think the top two things, and it's in the memo, 91% cited lack of professional support from administration to address challenges. So that was kind of a little bit more specific, right? Other 87% cited lack of respect. And so again, a little bit more specific, but maybe not as specific as you were thinking, Emily. And I do know in the report that it does break down what we define as work climate and culture into kind of what are kind of those subcategories that might fall under it, and kind of how did those rank out. And then if we read the more narrative pieces, it would play out more. I don't have like a clean direct answer for you.
Yeah, but the appendices do have the narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Anything else?
I know this wouldn't necessarily be in the report, but do we create a process around these recommendations or a timeline? Or I know they're going to be published and out there. I'd imagine you're going to have Ruth and Marcus conversations with IC and other stakeholders. But beyond that, let's say 8 months when no one's talking about our report anymore. Although I hope they are talking about it. Like, do we have as a board, idea of process around how to keep these alive?
So I'll first say this. I think, from my understanding, these recommendations are still kind of draft proposal coming out of the Teacher Retention Committee. And I think and again, I'm speaking from what I understand, there's an open discussion that can happen now about, are there other recommendations or clarification, like is there clarity that needs to happen amongst these 5 after you all have a fuller understanding and dive into the report? But to answer, I don't know how I would get to, I think your question's kind of second after, we establish recommendations, right, Zachary? Like, what would we do to make sure that those that actually have already been established are being...
My response to that would be, so part of it is the data warehouse, the legislation, which we are actively, aggressively dealing with. Part of this is to create a conversation. I mean, hopefully there'll be some attention to this, and we'll be continuing attention to it because it's interesting finding, and it's the first findings like this that we have, and that will help keep it all alive. And then I would think, we would and could send the recommendations to the appropriate agencies. I don't know that we're going to follow up each set with each agency.
That's what I'm getting at.
Well, the first thing that's going to happen is that it's going to be a press release. It's going to be in the news, so to speak. And we do have things here to talk about, such as because DCPS doesn't have a mentoring program for teachers, and they just started this year. I think for the first time they had someone in charge of climate and culture, a staff person, deputy superintendent, deputy whatever, so that it's incumbent upon us as a board to keep it alive. But I would hope that we testify in front of the city council about some of the recommendations. And these are recommendations for next year. Really, they're not going to do anything. There's nothing that's going to be done this year on this. But these are hopefully recommendations that happen in the summertime. So even at the beginning of school, when the teachers are there for a week before school starts, there should be some kind of a program for new teachers. They have new teacher introductions, but they don't follow them. But it's really going to be driven by how much feedback we as a board get. What do your constituents say about it?
We could bring it back to the committee. And you spoke to it. I think just having a more fleshed out idea around how do we keep the conversation alive, whether that's conversations in our wards, roundtables, testifying. I don't think we should necessarily, given the amount of work resources and time that went into this. I wouldn't necessarily leave that to chance and based on number of interests, but more so say, here are our recommendations as a committee, of how we would like you to engage the public around this.
Right, I mean, I think that, I know for me, every ANC meeting that I go to, once it's published, released completely, I'll be sharing it to make the constituents know about what the news about. Not us.
Maybe that's something we can do, is have sort of recommendations to members about how they can use it, learn for the.
Yes.
Talk about it.
But I thought we talked
And I
about
think
that.
that's for all of our work, not necessarily
Yeah,
just
no,
this.
it's a good.
Right.
I also wonder how we might disperse it sort of more broadly to the field, because I'm thinking about recommendations 2, 4, and 5. While 5 might be something that is taken on by an agency, I'm not exactly sure who would do that, right? So to my understanding, OSSI doesn't have a shop that deals with school leadership. They might offer a professional development, they might recruit a consultant to do that, but that's not something typically that OSSI does, is work with school level leaders because they work with LEAs. So thinking about how we get this out to the broader field of the kind of organizations that do this work already. You have organizations like EdFuel and School Leader Lab that do work with school leaders. And if they're able to say in their own work, hey, the state board has pointed out that this is a real need, and be able to use it as justification for the work they're already doing with schools or share it, I just think that that may be helpful. Because we do have so many organizations in the city that do work with our LEAs, making sure that we get this on their radar as well, whether it's sending press releases or tagging them in tweets, whatever it is.
I know OSSI does some community of practice work with school leaders already. The community schools group is one that also does some of those things with school leaders already. So I think there is some precedent, but I think your point is very well taken.
And one other thing, we've been playing around really since the fall about bringing in sort of a national person to talk about, sort of a national expert to talk about future turnover, to use that as part of the event. That also may help as well. More than the press release.
We also have, a lot of you to talk about
Oh, right.
the video or whatever it's called.
Yeah, so we just finished filming the teacher retention video series. We had experts come in. Alex had 2 students. We had SMEs and teachers. So we did about 2.5 hours of footage in total, and so now we're in the editing phase. It should be done in about a week or 2 for full release, full screening, I guess, and then we'll plan on the release. We're hoping that to create an event, as Rick said, around the release of it, and the survey results as well, so that can make it bigger.
And the video is how long?
It will be 2 or 3 minutes once we.
So it's sort of good for Twitter and all those.
Yes. We cut it into minutes.
And that video is made up of people that were part of the research or just general experts?
Say that question. Sorry,
Are the people on the video the people that were part of the research, or are these just general experts?
So
We
they're
don't know, right?
Yeah.
We don't know who the people who participated.
yeah. So the individuals that are speaking in the video is there are teachers, students, and then there are SMEs, so subject matter experts. We've had 4 individuals that have shared information with the board before, but also been partners in the work. Someone from Mathematica, someone from Learning Policy Institute, someone from New America, and someone from UDC from their education program. So
Anything else? Well, I just want to say, this has been quite a journey, as they say.
It has been an eye-opening journey,
Yes. So,
and it's all due to Alex.
so we're only. So just one more thing on process. So the event is coming together with some media and we are gonna adopt this report at the next meeting. Is there anything else we need to say in terms of that sort of?
No, I mean, the only other piece would be if there are edits or changes to the recommendations document, then we need to know that sometime soon too, so that then that can also be ready for the vote at the public meeting. We did also, and I think Alex mentioned this, we did, as is our practice, send an embargoed copy of the report to our agency partners. If they would like to comment, they have been offered the opportunity to do so. Then that will also then become part of our packet of information, which would include the recommendations, the report, and any responses from any of those agencies. So,
And stakeholder groups, all the people that were formerly involved in.
yes. Although, yes, the groups that have been involved in the process, yes. But particularly, we offer that opportunity for the agency partners if they have a reaction, I think, to the information that we're publicizing. So, as our rules are pretty strict in terms of transparency, so the report is on our website because it has to be part of the discussion in this meeting tonight. So it is now sort of live and out there and ready. But we did, like I said, provide the embargoed copy after the board members had a chance to review it. I sent it to the rest of the folks as well, so that they had an opportunity prior to it being technically public today.
So if all of our partners, the charter schools and DC public schools, they all think it's just a great report, then we got a news flash right there. So we expected to get phone calls from people about this or about that. Talking points, these are the talking points, I guess.
Yeah, we'll summarize this discussion and make sure that you all have talking points to talk about what the report says and pretty much this presentation that Alex made tonight. So you have that available for you if you do get questions from LEAs or from members of the public in the interim prior to it being adopted or being considered for adoption by the board in our March public meeting.
And I believe on the request or the dispersal, Alex was mentioned as the person that you need to get in touch with. So, if somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer to, just send them to Alex.
Just say, the talking points could include whatever details we can share just about the process.
Sure.
I'm assuming there's going to be. I just wanted to underscore.
No, I agree.
Just kind of how we collected, who participated.
Sure.
As part of our program.
Absolutely.
And we did talk the other day about, possible questions people might ask because there were a certain number of teachers that left, and the survey was sent out to a lot of people, but the number that the vendor was looking for was a number that we passed as far as a representative number of teachers to make it a valid survey, just like it would be a political survey or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it is, and I appreciate Jessica's point too in referencing the workforce report from OSSE. The results from our survey line up really closely, not only just in terms of like demographics type information, but also just in the responses. They line up very much with what OSSE found in their workplace report, which I did check and does not have any recommendations in it.
Thank you.
But that's one of the reasons that in the draft document that you have, at the end it is specifically noted that actually is the case, that although our sample could be larger if we had access to all of the data and all of the teachers, we do believe that it's absolutely in line with other documents that have been produced that have larger samples, and so
Yeah, I mean, the thing that stood out to me from this is also the national research on teacher retention and teacher attrition points out a couple of things. One of them that jumped out specifically, the piece about school leadership did not encourage them to stay after they indicated they would leave. That's been a hallmark of TNTP reports, national reports of teacher attrition. So I think this is sort of in the notion of like replication of research. We've now added another study that says all the things the studies have said before, including some specific facts to DC, and we should probably start to listen to all the research that keeps saying the same thing. And I'm really glad that we've added recommendations, because I think to the point you made, TNTP's workforce report does not include recommendations, so we're saying, look, we found the same stuff. Here's what we think you ought to do with that.
And just
Lisa, thank you.
two other little things. Number one on the recommendations is, we decided it was number one on the recommendations because that is that we couldn't get the information from it took us a long, from DCPS really didn't give it to us. And especially from the charter schools. We didn't, and it wasn't asking for any kind of secretive information. We just wanted to know who the teachers were that left. And then we do the rest of the work. But we couldn't get that information. So with this adoption of the statewide educational data warehouse, if that passes, then we would be able to adopt that information. And it would have made a bigger sample. The results might not have been any different, but it would have made a bigger sample. And the other thing too, I think, and this is, I didn't think about it the other day, is we probably want to put 4 and 5 together and rewrite it in some kind of a way that mentions, because you were correct about how vacuous improves school culture. That's not really a recommendation. It's like saying all kids come to class on time.
All students succeed.
Yeah, right. So maybe we could
Be a,
Or maybe those,
just rewrite it, put them together.
or maybe there's something in those findings that if we think about sort of another very particular thing.
Okay.
In addition to the principle of training, sort of another very
Right.
clear, or under there, like 3 sub.
specific, so.
Alex, one more question. I know you mentioned demographics, and I know the respondents were self-reporting.
Yeah.
But did we have any key findings around racial disparities? I know we're talking on tonight's agenda around Latinx teachers. I know, for instance, Black teachers, the numbers of Black teachers in the city have decreased over 40% over the last decade. And so, again, just a tension I regularly have with our work on teacher attrition. It's great, it's an issue, but I don't know if we have our finger on the pulse of how this is disproportionately impacting certain communities versus others. So I think I know the answer to that. I in part wanted to just say that. But if you did have any feedback on that, maybe that could be incorporated into our recommendations as well.
Because there is a whole thing about the Ward 8 teachers in particular, as I recall. So I think that's a very good point. And to sort of bring back into it the idea that this has a disproportional impact on a certain set of schools, and be clear about what those schools are.
But to be clear, not just the schools, but different racial teachers. So Latinx teachers versus Black teachers versus biracial teachers versus women versus men. I think there are many ways we can splice it just to see if there are any.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't
That might
know.
not be it,
No,
but-
that's a good one, and I don't know the answer to that. But I do think we should be prominent about part of why we're taking this up as an issue is because of the disproportionate impact on high poverty schools. That's for the highest.
We'll take a look.
turnovers.
Right.
DCPS is has an initiative for hiring or trying to recruit male teachers, in particular of color, focus on African American and Latino. I don't know what's in there.
We'll take a look through the report again and some of the data and see what we can.
So maybe,
What we do.
recommendations might be, we might need to
Research.
find out more about what's already happening and then making recommendations that
Yeah.
make
That is one of the things that is not necessarily recommended is other types of research. So it could also be one of those things too that more research on these particular things are needed. Maybe something interesting too.
Okay.
One other thing too, that I think is really important, and Alex and I talked about it, was how many teachers retire. Because I think that we'll find out that the number of teachers who retire has dramatically dropped in the last 10 years.
Because they're so young.
Compared to the number of teachers that have left the system. I'm talking about old people that have been teaching for over if you look at those figures for under 5 and under 10, I think that that's something that they don't want to deal with, and because
Connects directly to the racial question.
it probably does, but it also
It definitely does. If you
connects.
imagine what DC used to be in terms of racial
Oh,
background
yeah.
and who was likely the teachers to retire versus a more trans.
Well, if you look at Cardozo right now, and if you look at the faculty at Cardozo right now, look at the faculty at Cardozo 10 years ago, racial, it's a huge racial difference. Than it used to be.
You know, one other thing to pick up on that I think maybe we want to put into the summary of the findings or something is one of the issues that does come up in a lot of places is this idea that one of the reasons teacher turnover is so high these days is because young people, these millennials, they don't like to stay in their job very long, and that's why they're leaving. And I think part of what this is saying is no, they're not leaving because they want to move on, they're leaving because it's not a pleasant place to be. And I think to push back on that and say, you know, we want people who see this as a job, you know, who see this as a career.
Career, not a job.
Yeah, no, as a career.
And
It's
have
really
vocation.
an important thing to get people to think that way.
Also, one thing on your letter, you had kids. Can you change kids to children, please? I love you too, Karen.
No goats, we have no
Now,
goats.
but the other thing is, and I think you saw it on the flyer that I gave you the other day for my book collection thing. It's Mrs. O'Leary's Books for Friends, because I never heard, she never talked about children. She always talked about friends. You know, that's how she talked to the children in the classroom, friends.
All right. Okay, we are moving on, and I will acknowledge I'm not being a very disciplined chair in part because I let the conversation go on the meeting too long, so I don't feel empowered to sort of shut it down on other things. But so everybody be under their own discipline.
That's right, we're only about an hour behind.
Okay, so we're going to hiring Latinx teachers, and let me say to introduce I mean, you're going to introduce it, but keep in mind we're going to have I think the idea, the process should be to raise things here. We're going to vote on it, presumably at the next meeting, right? So the thing is to raise things so Emily knows them, so maybe we can do some stuff, you know, sort of in the email between now and then. Right, so.
Yes, yep, and I'm going to be very disciplined. Okay,
But I want the conversation. The discipline is not meant to get rid of the conversation.
so I will just very briefly say why I became interested in this topic and think it's worthy of this resolution. So in my ward, as you know, and as it states in this resolution, we have the highest proportion of Latinx students. It's 50% in Ward 1. And we also have the highest proportion of dual language programs in Spanish. And so but what I'll say is, even the 2 elementary schools that are not dual language or have the track of immersion, they have a very high Latinx student population. So, does that make sense? So over 60% or higher. So, in my conversations with principals in both of those types of schools, an issue that has come up is that when they want to hire more Latinx teachers, even in the single language programs, but they feel like they're in competition with other schools, right? Especially for the schools that are not dual language, if they want to hire a math teacher who's Latinx, they feel like it's much harder because teachers are more likely to go to the dual language programs, but they feel like it's really important for all the reasons research has shown that their kids also have teachers who look like them and understand their culture to a greater degree. So that's from the principal's perspective. I've also heard from teachers who work in those schools that are not dual language that it can be very lonely and that there isn't the same culture that there is in the dual language programs. But even the teachers who are in the dual language programs talk about how they get asked to do a lot of extra work, like translating both written documents and, you know, getting called into conferences and things like that. And they feel like there should just be more staff who are bilingual and or people who are actually in those positions to officially do that, or they should get paid. So that's another issue. And then in one of the courses that I teach in Georgetown, the students actually do work and research outside of the classroom, and one of the groups that formed in my class last semester was really interested in this topic. And I was like, great, I'll find out like an organization that's doing this work. And it turned out the Empower Ed Teacher Task Force was doing this work. And so they worked with them. A lot of the research they did ended up in that report that Empower Ed put out. And so part of that was doing interviews with students at all levels, elementary and high school. And so they got a lot of feedback about how important it was for them to have teachers look like that. So for all of those reasons, I felt compelled to bring this to your attention. And I will just add one more thing, which is that sort of serendipitously this Saturday, I was at the WTU Sharing Vision Conference, and I went to the session that the Latinx Teacher Task Force held, and I just got a lot of more information from them. And so there are some things that they suggested. I shared this with them, and they suggested a few things. So I'll just go through those real quickly, and that's what I'm hoping kind of to get from this is like, is this a good idea, first of all? And then if so, like, what should we change? What should we add? What do you think makes sense? So I'll just give you a sense of what came up in that meeting. So hiring experienced Latinx teachers leaders to become the mentors of those who are new to the system. So mentorship was a big issue. They come here really not having background on like, they don't know what to expect. So even teachers who have experience in their home country end up feeling really, some of them just felt like, wow, I don't know how to do classroom management. And Fraser, to your point, you asked a question on the dais the other day, or last week, about impact, and that came up in this meeting. That they, especially in their first year, they get impacted, and then they were saying, the person doesn't speak Spanish, who comes to see them, they don't necessarily know what to look for in a dual language classroom, and also they are brand new, and they don't know how to manage an American classroom, right? So all those things came up. Funding be provided or to waive or compensate costs of things like praxis, taking a praxis. That did the district sponsor green cards for Latinx teachers, and this is actually something apparently DCPS is looking into. And working visas for spouses. That their credentials that they're bringing from their home country perhaps be honored, especially if they have like a master's or a PhD and teaching experience, that maybe that would take the place of having to do the praxis. And that they allow a period of 3 years for Latinx educators to acquire their teacher licensure here. That used to be the case apparently, and it was changed recently, and so now teachers have to get their licensure in their home country in order even to get a visa. And so that, I guess, has been problematic. And what they're saying is they should go back to the old way of like, they come, they get their visa, they're teaching, and then they get to like take the test at some point during their stay here. And then one last thing, which is, no, that was it. Comments? Yes.
I have a question about Latinx.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot from former students and people I know that are offended by that.
I agree.
And so I don't understand how, and it's real. People talk about it on Facebook, people talk about it here and there, but this really bothers me.
I think I don't really know what to say to that actually. I've heard both sides of it. But I haven't heard a lot of the, I have met one person and she was older who was offended by it. And I don't know what other people's experience has been, but I'm wondering if it is a generation.
Most of mine comes from millennials who tell me like I'm a Latina. Period. End of story.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about him, he's a Latino. Like that's how that
Latino
goes.
or Latina. Do
But I
not
think,
use
but I think the X comes in as we've evolved as a society in our representation of gender identity, and not wanting to offend others in that way. But to the point, some do take offense. I haven't heard anyone say they were offended, but I have heard people say I carry the definition of Latina in particular with pride, and so refer to me that way. So I don't know. I don't have any strong objection to this, nor do I have an opinion of how
Yeah.
else we say it.
I'm like,
Can we change it to Hispanic?
I'm just telling you, no, they're offended by Hispanic,
People
you
are
know, but, you know,
It's true of
Latino
or just Latin. Can we say
Spanish
Latin?
speaking.
I'll
No, we-
test
I was
it.
thinking Spanish speaking.
Well, but they may not.
You don't have to speak Spanish to be.
Of Latin
Yeah,
descent.
right,
We
exactly.
say
Well,
Latin
yeah,
descent.
that's the Hispanic is only just because you're
And
Spanish.
why
speaking.
wouldn't you have to? Latino or Latino?
How about just the staff would look into potential alternatives and we'll get back on that.
Okay.
I had a question as well. The $2 million figure, where that
So you're good.
the $2 million
Right,
figure.
so I mentioned Empower Ed, I also have been, speaking with, DC Language Immersion, they are also doing work around, not specifically, Latinx teachers, but around, this idea of a, language immersion accelerator program. And the idea with that is that it would take the onus off of LEAs, and also they would be partnering with OSSI, because some of these tasks that they list here would be OSSI's responsibility, so they would take that on, and basically perform some of the professional development, like HR, things that the teachers are finding difficult, then helping them navigate the issue of being scammed came up briefly, right? And so they would help to prevent that kind of thing. They would act as sort of a guiding agency. So they would also make it easier for teachers, not just Latinx teachers to come, but also teachers, who speak different languages from, immigrant teachers in general.
Yeah, no. I mean,
So the $2 million is from them. That's
Yeah,
what they
that's what I was asking.
figured out, like, it would cost that much to do what they need to do.
Yeah, no, I thought it was an interesting idea. I was just wondering who had priced it out. So it was DC immersion. Okay.
Support.
So taking a step back, why are we, because we've heard about the need for not just Spanish speaking and Latino teachers, but also the need for teachers in general of color. Okay, would it be possible to broaden this and say we're looking have an overarching recommendation to add more teachers of color as well to this?
Yeah, so the reason why this is specific to Latinx teachers is because there is the language component. So that's also why it's combined with the DC language immersion ideas, is because it's about sort of bringing more dual language to DC, and this one is specific to Spanish speaking because there are so many Spanish speaking students, especially in Port Huenot's. But it is a citywide.
Right. And another of the couple of the issues with the recommendations, I had the same question about the $2 million. I almost, not that I'm against the accelerator, but I would prefer to take that out because we're asking for money, or changing that paragraph around where we're asking for the accelerator, but in a way without asking for money, or specifically $2 million specifically.
Yeah,
Saying consider or consider in her budget a proposal for this accelerator or something
it's
in
a
that
fund,
manner.
it's not a $2 million.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes sense.
Or maybe say it's been said that it would require $2 million, but just generally.
Yeah, or list out this organization. Well, I don't even like saying because these two advocacy organizations say it's $2 million. Lastly, I thought all praxis exams were already in Spanish. They can be given in Spanish, English, Chinese, and one other, Mandarin, and one other. Practice. Yes. Is it?
What I understand is that the praxis one is, and that's sort of the general core
Right.
pedagogy and everything. So the argument that's being made is that either all of the praxis, there are 3,
But yeah.
and that all of them should be given in Spanish. But actually, we've made a point, which I think is not a bad point, which is that if you are teaching, if you happen to be Latinx and you're teaching math, for instance,
You need to be
you need
able
to
to speak
English.
English. Yeah.
It's sort of a special thing for if you're in a dual language or speaking that
So a
language.
point that was made actually at this meeting I went to though on Saturday was that, and this is not necessarily a language issue, it's more a cultural issue, that the test as it is, an American culture test, right? And so so that's a different issue. I mean, you could have it in English and have screen it for references that are very specifically American. But that was one of the issues I think. Because that's not what you want to test. Zach and then
So just 5 quick points. One, thank you for highlighting this. Start there. And I definitely think it's a need connected to what Ashley was saying. I wouldn't necessarily advocate for tabling this, but I do think there could be a complementary resolution for other racial groups in particular. Just a few thoughts. This first suggestion, line 60, that the mayor add $2 million. So again, I'm having tension personally, and this is nothing with the whole push for dual language immersion. I get it generally, but we also know that every dual language immersion program at school is not catering to or even attended by Latinx or Latinx children. Let's just put it that way. I can name several in Ward 5 where if we're generally just saying we're going to allocate $2 million for these schools, in some places that might mean very wealthy, affluent white children and not the children I think you are wanting to target based on how you framed it. So I would just recommend figuring out, changing, subtracting that where we are actually sending resources to the children that really need it versus the banner of dual language immersion programs. Because in Ward 1 it may look different, but I know in Ward 5 they don't necessarily look that way. Another thought I had was line 75. The recommendation that IC conduct a full review of teacher workforce, pipeline, processes, and identify barriers. I think that's a great recommendation. I would recommend perhaps listing out some barriers, or do we have ideas of what barriers might exist? I know you're saying you should conduct research. We even just have a teacher attrition report that maybe we can pull a line or two to say school culture and climate, for instance. If there are some racial demographic figures, maybe that could just add more meat there, because as I read it, it just reads vague in general. And then lastly,
the attrition is probably a smaller problem than the issue of just not getting Latinx teachers into the workforce.
Well, there's a visa issue, the attrition.
yeah.
I mean, the attrition sometimes, and I would say actually quite often, is because they're not able to extend their visas or they're stuck. That was another
Yeah, knowing that there is some overlap there, just essentially like what are the barriers that we know that maybe even in the aforementioned part we might be able to cite it. Whereas, and then lastly, just 83, the recommendation around the school report card. What I'm taking this to mean is that schools would receive credit for having a diverse teaching staff. Is that the idea? And that would be incorporated in their star rating.
So I purposely made it two parts. So one part is that it might be added as, information on the dashboard.
Love
part.
that. Love that. I
And
think we start getting into tricky territory when you might penalize, reward schools. I'm just thinking not necessarily reward one schools. My mind went to schools across the city and what that might mean if we added that as a metric. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Can I just respond to your first point?
And that's it, by the way.
I agree. I mean, even in the one, the tension that you're talking about is there, right? And I think the issue is that, or the response is that if you have more dual language programs, that more kids can attend. That
The
there is a
rising
lot.
tide lifts all boats.
In this case, yes, or that if you have a small pie, you would have to cut it up, into really small pieces to have enough for everyone, or you just don't have enough for everyone. But if you have more pies, then you can talk about how to distribute it more effectively and more equitably. So I think with the accelerator in particular, which is what you were pointing to, that is the idea behind that, is just creating many more pies. And especially in the wards that have fewer, because the argument of DC language immersion in particular is that language immersion is really important for everyone. Especially for kids who are learning English, but also for everyone, just because for so many reasons, right?
Don't disagree. Don't
Yeah.
disagree there.
So that is the response to that. But I hear you about the 2 million. I originally did not have that in there, and I had the information, so I thought I would put it in. But I agree that.
I guess the headline there, just to underscore, is I don't know if this is getting to what you articulated. What you articulated is that we want more support and resources targeting Latinx children in schools in Ward 1, but across the city. And for the reasons we've already mentioned, I just don't know if this language does that.
In that particular.
In that section.
That's about programs for such students that are dual language, is the purpose of that.
Well, I get it, but I guess my recommendation, my preference would be to take it out for the reasons I already mentioned, because if we're allocating $2 million for schools that are catering to, I shouldn't say catering, educating affluent children, like while they deserve dual language programs just like anyone else, that's not the framing that I think you mentioned. So there's just a tension there. That's all.
So I'm going to start on that same point, but I think for me the question around the accelerator was a little more complicated. When I heard the testimony from the DC language immersion folks, they are looking for funding to do this work and then hand it off to OSSI. So we're asking here for $2 million for a private entity. That makes me really uncomfortable. I feel very uncomfortable in our resolution pointing to anything with a private entity, because then the question is, why wouldn't we do that for the DC Special Education Co-op, which seeks to do the same kind of thing around special ed for charter schools? So my concern with this particular section, that bullet, is that it's an odd precedent to set, that we're going to point out specific nonprofits that we're asking to be supported, either with a number certain or a vague number, but that just makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
It's not the effort. I get the effort, and I might even support moving it into a whereas statement. But I don't like that we're recommending that this nonprofit, not some other nonprofit, not some effort about accelerating the opportunities of dual language be placed somewhere. So
I will say I am mentioning that specific agency because they're the ones that I'm referencing here. I mean, they have the idea, but they're not named here. And so the idea is that,
But isn't the accelerator
but they testified before us publicly saying they wanted to do this, giving us all the details on what it would
And this is
be.
their projection for how much it would cost.
I understand,
Yeah,
but what
yeah, so I'm, all I'm, and so I'm agreeing with you, I know it's tricky, I guess, but it's a good idea. And so, I guess what I'm proposing is, they may not get the money, but the idea should still be supported.
Well, then what
right?
Jess was saying about it being aware is, makes it even
Yeah,
more sense.
no, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So it's not a.
Then it may resolve somehow to fund the expansion of these programs.
Yeah.
The second concern I have is under the other resolved pieces, 3 of them, the 4 of them apply to OSSI and 1 is to DHR. We have connection to OSSI in a way that we don't to DHR, so I think that's a trickier one to put in here. Because we do have a working relationship with and a policy relationship with OSSI. So I feel very comfortable with those bullets, including the edits that you and Zachary just discussed for the last bullet around including information on the report card. I would not be as excited about putting that as a star rating metric. Partially because I would want to have a lot more discussion and public input before proposing that as a recommendation. But I do like the idea of putting it as data. And I would encourage that we want to say school resources that matter to them. I like all that part. But then I'm going to sort of land on my really big concern, which goes back to my strategy point at the beginning of the conversation. We have really good evidence in hand from an organization that has done the work to put this report together. I like all the whereases. I'd be very much in support of a resolution that acknowledged that this has been raised as an issue and the state board wants to stand behind it. When we get into specific recommendations that focus on Latino and Latina and Latinx educators, I get more nervous around to what extent is it an access issue. A group asked us to talk about this, they came and gave lots of public testimony, they sent us reports, and now we're passing a resolution that serves them. Are we encouraging, which I'd be all for, Black educators to come and say, actually, we need a resolution that supports all these efforts on our part? Are we going to get one from Asian educators next? Are we going to get one from, more senior educators? Are we going to encourage that sort of special interest to come and do this? And if we are, I'm fine with that, right? We want to throw the doors open wide and say, we've got a big table, come testify to us, and we will write you a recommendation, resolution.
Yeah, I hear you.
If we're not going to go down that road, I worry a little bit about what we say by making these specific recommendations about OSSI taking action on X for this group. I take no issue at all with the whereases. It's the be it resolved that OSSI do this for this group.
Yeah, I don't see it that way.
I know you don't, but I got to say what I see it as because you got to share a whole resolution.
Okay. Yeah, you just made a long. Yeah. So let me not say I'm not countering you. I'm just giving you my response. So my response is this: I have heard these concerns in my board. So what? These are issues that are very real in my ward, and I've heard them from all stakeholders, right? I mean, I'm not saying not all stakeholders. I mean stakeholders at each level, so students, parents, teachers, principals, right? Then there are advocacy organizations and nonprofits that are actually doing work that address those issues, and I think that's sort of why I don't think it's haphazard what we're doing. It's more that.
Please note that I didn't say it was haphazard.
But that's, I guess, to Jack's comment before. So you said, what was the word you used?
Not planned anyway. Yeah,
Right.
that's fine.
My point is that it's not starting with the agency, as you're saying. You know, you're saying an agency or a group comes in and says X, and we jump on that bandwagon. That is not the case here. I am hearing something from my constituents. I am aware that it's not just Ward 1, it's just much more prevalent in Ward 1. And then I am also looking at who's doing work around this issue and who's pushing this, to a wider audience, and who is, going to council and testifying with real solid ideas. And I think that it's silly for me not to then, partner with those folks and my capacity here and bringing to all of you. So I'm just saying that's how I'm seeing it. I think my horse is different than your horse.
Well, so
Like, what-
here's how I'll say where I stand on this then. If this were to end with therefore be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education acknowledges the needs of Latinx educators are not being met in the city, and that we would encourage both advocacy organizations and OSSI to take up these issues and work together on them, I would vote for it. With these specific recommendations that prioritize a specific group of educators who did come before us and make this public testimony, I would not vote for it. And I would not do that with all these recommendations specifically because I am worried about equity of access. Like, I don't know who's going to stand up for the Black educators in the city, but we're seeing this enormous loss of 40% reduction over 10 years of African American educators in a city that still educates a majority of African American students in our schools. So the question then is, like, is it our job to go round up who's on this work for Black educators, come before us so that we can write you a resolution too? Or is it that we would bring a resolution to say, hey, this matters to folks in my ward? And then where do we draw the line? And this goes back to a discussion we had 2 working sessions ago around what resolutions will the state board pass? Will they be ceremonial and then we have a sense of the board, or we had policy resolutions? This to me lives in that murky space. And given that it's prioritizing a very specific group of educators who did make this effort to come before us, I worry that it sets us on a slippery slope.
And just to underscore my previous point, I would generally support this. I would not be willing to support with calling out this dual language immersion just for, because I think it's truly inequitable. That's my own intention.
You mean the accelerator.
The accelerator portion, because at least in Ward 5, the students who have access to those programs are not the students that the spirit of this resolution is speaking to.
Right, but do you
Generally.
agree that if there were more programs that it could be more fair?
Yes, in theory. I mean, if we made everyone richer, there would be no homeless
So,
people. But I think this is not, one, I'm not necessarily making the connection between hiring Latinx teachers and this inclusion, but also, more importantly, I just feel like it's a catch-all, and I'm not making the connection with this program.
So one thing
Without that, I would
I
be
want
fully
to
supportive.
intervene on, which is just to say this, we all want to hear both sides and the response, and we want to get everything out, and Emily needs all that so she can go back and think about how to revise, and yet we can't do it endlessly. So, as interesting as it is, actually I find it very interesting. So what I'm going to ask is if there are other people who want to raise things, to raise them as recommendations, suggestions, and then we're going to see another draft, presumably by email, and we've got 2 weeks to sort of continue to respond and have a group discussion over email.
But can I just get clarification on Jessica's point for the resolved part? So you're saying, can you just say briefly again what you would want to see in place of what's here now?
For me, this is a bigger issue of what are we going to pass resolutions on? How are we going to allow those to be generated?
I heard that, but what you said something really specific. You said if this said.
So previously, when we've gotten reports from Empower Ed, right, and I am pointing this out because a lot of the facts you did note that you also went to the WTU meeting where you heard from some of the same teachers who were part of this process, and you went to another, like you've heard this from folks in your ward, but we've got this report here and it's right behind this. So I'm saying if this was about like, hey, this has been brought to our attention, this is an issue of importance to the district, I'm fine with it. When it says, hey, this is important, this is an issue to the district that came to us from an outside group, and we're making specific policy recommendations to OSSI to focus on this specific group, I get real nervous around who are we not doing that for? How do people gain access to us to get that kind of priority in our agenda? And I would be, and again, I know this is a bigger issue and not what you're asking me here, but if we're throwing open the doors wide and saying, come one, come all, publicly testify to us, and this is going to become our precedent, great, I'm all for it. we have not typically passed resolutions as a result of it.
Right.
Our board
But if it's relevant, we could. I'm just
What
saying
about-
if it's, yeah.
I'm saying,
Well, I'm saying
2 months ago, we had a big discussion about how we were gonna talk about what kind of resolutions we're gonna pass. We know we did not land on what the answer
We
was.
just-
We landed to say that we weren't gonna change our process.
Right, and then people would have to make their choices
Oh,
based
Ethel,
on.
you were sick at the last board meeting session. Ruth decided that.
Yes,
you're
the people
going
would just bring them
to-
forward.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm saying that in the spirit of that, I am saying that this to me is a bridge too far. And I want to let the sponsor of this resolution know
Absolutely
that I would vote against it, and
Absolutely.
this is why.
Absolutely appropriate. That is exactly the conversation we should have.
And I-
Well motivated, responded to, part of the record, part of your
To
consideration.
your question though, not to speak for you, but what I think I heard earlier was the whereas section maybe is solid, take out the therefore section. So therefore take out the policy recommendations and keep it more.
No,
Well,
I think
That's what I'm saying. I draw my line.
You asked the question,
That's
what
what
was
Jessica-
the
Herein, and I will say this because I do think this should go on the record. I think it's wonderful to have debate and discussion and disagreement. I dislike it when people share their thoughts and it's like, but wait, but why this? But why that? That feels very uncomfortable because we're not all gonna agree.
But part of having a discussion is saying, why do you think this? So I just want to
It's
say
not that
it's a
way,
back
and
and
you
forth.
know what I'm getting at here. What I'm getting at is that I would say, yes, I would draw the line at whereas, and anything beyond that, I would vote no.
But wait,
No, and she didn't, and she
That's
didn't
my point, it's
understand
the, but wait.
that. No, but she didn't understand that, so she was coming back to understand that that was the case, and then she wanted to continue the discussion, and I said, you can't because we gotta get out of here.
Oh, I thought you were talking about me presenting my ideas and people doing that to me. So that's what I was like, okay, no, I'm
All right.
fine.
All right,
There you go.
other conversation on this, ideas, comments? All right. Emily has a lot of comments, a lot of ideas, a lot of understanding of where she will get votes and where she won't. And so come forward with
Is it
a,
safe to assume those who didn't mention are in favor of the resolution?
Well,
she's gonna do a draft and send it
I'll
back,
put
right?
out a draft, I'll send it around and you guys can let me know what you think.
And if there are other people who have particular, want to say an email, not here, there's no way I'm gonna do it or get rid of this, I think that would be totally appropriate. I think the idea
The
here
spirit
is
of this, right?
if there's a way that a resolution can be drawn up that captures a lot of what Emily has put here and that meets the approval of at least 5 and preferably more, that's what we're aiming for. And so comments that aid in that are welcome, I think. All right. Okay, now
Where do we homeless students?
all right, homeless students resolution.
Did anyone have any adjustments or changes to the draft resolution that was provided via email and also in the packet? It's currently SR 20-3, the homeless resolution. This is the one that's been revised based on earlier comments from board members at our February working session.
Will all the LEAs have information on the homeless students?
How do you read it?
Every LA has to have a McKinney-Vento rep.
I know, but when we were talking about it, when you were talking about the reading specialist, sometimes some principal will designate Zachary as the reading specialist.
And I think that's one of the things that we have heard from the ombudsman and student advocate's office as
Right.
well, that sometimes the person designated as the McKinney-Vento may not be fully trained or maybe new to the position or have many other responsibilities. And I think that's a very valid point.
That's why I brought it up, and because on line 67, I'm sure it's one of my typos, be further resolved that the state board recommends that LEAs be required to break down the use of funds. Can we do that?
Yeah, I was confused at this whole section.
Wait, where are you?
Line 67.
Be further resolved that the state resolved that the state board recommends that LEAs be required to break down the use of funds to support homeless students. And my question was, do the LEAs know who the homeless students are? Because we're talking about DCPS as an LEA. And I know that every school has to have someone designated to take care of that.
And we know this isn't gonna happen.
That they have to have a designee, but no, they don't have clarity on every single homeless student. If you recall, one person testified that there's an office, but there's also chains around it.
No,
So
but
some
there are all kinds of
So
then-
things that designate a homeless student. Plus, we got students who become non-homeless.
But that was part of their criticism that OSSI has they would argue, a limited definition of what's homeless, when there's actually probably many more students who are in fact homeless too.
So that maybe that paragraph should bring OSSI into it.
What I think I'm reading this as, who wrote this?
Staff.
What I'm reading this as is that LEAs have to do a line item budget showing how funds are spent on
Can
homeless
I
students.
recognize myself because I have a specific amendment? Which is, because I had a similar thing, it shouldn't be about the state board, I had that the state board recommends that LEAs be required to break down the use of funds to support homeless students so that oversight agencies and advocacy groups can better determine what next steps and recommendations should be.
Right,
In
so
other words,
that's
it's not
enough.
our job, it's that, this is why we need to have some transparency.
And I wasn't even talking about that. So you just added on to the problem with that paragraph.
So, again, I think your question is, do LEAs have the ability to track the funds that they are using for homeless things? And I think that's the reason that this particular part is in here is because no, they don't necessarily track just the homeless.
But they can, but they could.
Based on who's identified.
Yes.
But you're assuming, by this paragraph, you're assuming they do.
Yes.
It's assuming that they do what they're supposed to do.
Yes. I think it's assumed, like, if they don't already, then they would have to do that first part in order to comply with it. Yes.
Yeah, so that has to be, whose is this?
It's ours.
It's ours. Then I think we, I'll try to do something with that.
Great. Also, I would just, line 71, I'm not clear what transportation plans we want. It seems redundant with 75, which is calling for an increase in the transportation, which seems in line with what we heard, but also the big scandal over ending the shuttle. We heard that the DME is going to continue to shuttle, and what we've heard from the DME is that they're still in this experiment of seeing if it works, and so I'm not quite sure what transportation plans
To
we
further,
would be asking.
to piggyback on that, because that was my question too. It's not just, so there are homeless students, not just in two hotels on New York Avenue. There are homeless students in multiple different shelters in multiple different areas of the city. Not just shelters, but different transitional housing programs. So it's almost impossible to create a permanent shuttle program for all homeless students who are being in transitional housing to get them to metro centers or the particular bus situation that was also happened. It came from DC General. It was originally a DC General bus that went to different schools. Okay, that is specific to those two hotels because of the fact there is no access to other public transportation in the area. Some of the new homeless shelters going into wards are very easily accessible to metro stations, to public bus systems, to other forms of public transportation. So that is a big, you're lumping a lot of things into into 4 lines.
I think that's a good point. So what if we called out in the whereas section, like the issues surrounding those two hotels in particular?
Or consider access.
This is mainly about that shuttle
Access opportunities.
experience.
Broaden it.
Yeah, you can just say that. You can say to create transportation plans for all homeless students.
Yeah, I think that's a smart plan. I will also say I think it's beyond the scope of our resolution. On the other hand, it is my dearest hope that as we move to these family shelters and we have moved families out of hotels, which is the plan by the end of December, that the city is cognizant of moving families into shelters that are accessible to their children's schools.
Well,
And I wish that was the case.
Or that there's anyone even planning to try that.
Right. The point, and I tend to agree that this section needs to be fixed. The recommendation I actually had is that OSSI create and make public a yearly transportation plan for students experiencing homelessness. Because the fact is, yes, homeless families will move around, and the varying degrees to which they'll need transportation access will shift from year to year. But even if it's that, 1 year, let me just say this. One, I'm glad we're recommending that OSSI own this process. They are in charge of transportation services by and large, but for some reason, the transportation programs for our homeless students aren't owned by OSSI currently. So I think that is an important piece of the recommendation. But I think given the transiency and the evolving nature of the services we're providing to homeless families, OSSI creating and making public a yearly plan for how we fill those gaps, I think is going to be super important, whether it's from a central shelter site or it's from 8 individual family shelter sites across the city.
And you're recommending that in lieu of the 4 lines?
I'm just trying to, I think, just get out my recommendations about how we specify that language in a way that I think gets to the point, which I think is that we want to know that students who have significant gaps in transportation access that they'll be applying year to year to support them in a way that makes sense. So I think that's important, and I think that annual plan also gives opportunity for the city to explain why or why not. If we're not providing certain services at a certain site or in a certain community, why or why not, I think is important. And for that second, or I guess for that third bid, fourth bid result that starts on 75, really being inclusive, and I think that last line that begins on 77 after the M dash that talks about students who are experiencing homelessness. I also don't want Kids Ride Free to be the response, and so talking about families who experience homelessness and about how I think specifying in a real way that we have an obligation to those families, right, to the families who are taking young children who can ride free on the bus but they can't to really have that access. I think is important. So changing kind of students to families in that context.
In theory, McKinney-Vento allows for the schools to give metro cards to families who are homeless, but what the reports are that they often don't have enough supply, and where families don't afford.
Super basic question. The ombudsman and student advocate, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Been reviewed, yeah.
Other comments, questions?
Sorry, Alex, can you speak up? I can't hear you.
That they get ignored. I mean, I'll let the writer, but I assume that's what it is. They don't feel seen.
Yeah, so I think some of it is the lack of visibility of how to access services if you are facing housing instability or homelessness. Like, how do you access that in a way that is not embarrassing to the students, and that it needs to be a process that is easy, so you don't feel like you are alone in that situation. If I'm, and this is me trying to remember back from the testimony that we received from these specific groups.
I would have read that to mean, and I can just
Yeah.
say what I read that as was sort of the issue that was brought up around the shame piece and families actually not coming forward and saying that they're homeless, and so that renders them invisible.
I think that's good. I think that is also part of it. Yeah. I'm open to working on how to change that to better, make it better readable.
Clear,
Yeah.
what it means.
I mean, if you want to send me some language like that.
Well, is it possible to find out what the source is of that? Or?
Sure. We can look for sources and clarify.
I think it's also do like the doubling up situation, that when families double up, they don't often report themselves as homeless. They're often not coded by schools, but
Yeah.
they're living in situations that
Because they may not know, right?
Right.
The school may not know that you know that there's been housing instability, which is a different thing from homelessness too. Although
Two things. One, wanted to go back to what Fraser started with, which I actually think is a really good point around the definition of homeless students. What we heard was OSSI uses a very limited definition, and therefore the number is likely larger. And so maybe there's an opportunity to include that, either to revisit the definition or to work with stakeholders to refine the definition to be more accurate of the context that's happening in schools. And then the second thing, and I know people may have varying opinions about the policy, but I do think this could potentially dovetail with Allen's metro legislation. Now, I'm not saying we include that in
Yeah, I was gonna
Ashley
say.
shopping the meth eyes. I'm not saying we include it here, but there could be, in my mind, conversation if we were to pass this to say, hey, is that an opportunity to take action on some of these therefores in that policy, maybe as an amendment? In particular, like the OSSI transportation plans, which I think goes hand in hand in theory with free metro. Just throwing that out there, I know there will probably need to be a lot more discussion on it.
And I think directly in line with that, right, a part of that was also dedicated funding to improve bus service and how we plan our bus service in conjunction with how it serves members of our community, including folks at temporary and transitional housing, and how we better connect those large communities of residents experiencing homelessness to metro stations and things like that. I think could go right in line.
So, the last thing I would just say, I know Ashley and Jack are bringing a proposal, it sounds like, to make a deliberative process, and so maybe that could, I would not recommend including that language around that bill in this resolution, but that could be something, if the board is up to it, that we try out that process to say, is this even something worth discussing or taking up in a more efficient manner, from going from this resolution to offer it to Allen, team, council, colleagues.
And maybe it's just a recommendation around making sure that policymakers, as they talk about improving our transportation networks, think specifically about how to better connect families experiencing homelessness to public transit. And I mean, that doesn't speak directly to any specific bill, but at least I think makes the overture that it should be important as we're having a citywide conversation about improving transportation networks, that we think about that in a very specific way.
So, I wanted, so one thing I wanted to say is I thought this was a great discussion, and part of why it was a great discussion, I think, is because the resolution was so good and sort of really drawing out a lot of the particulars that we heard from the advocates, and I really wanted to thank the staff very much for doing it. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to do that in our resolutions actually connects right up with what Zach and Marcus were saying, which is this, because it's laid out in this resolution what the problems are, I think it becomes a resolution that each of us individually, whatever the board, can take and send to the relevant council people around this metro legislation and say, look, we adopted this, look at these examples, this is part of why we need it, and I think it will be very helpful for that. And likewise around that, because part of what I'm always, I mean, part of the way, you know, I am for being opportunistic, and I'm for being opportunistic because I think it's a strategy. We're a small board, we don't have a lot of staff, so how do you generate interest and support for different things? And to me, I see this as part of the way. And I'm always sort of exploring and trying to better understand a way to do it. So one of the things that also strikes me with this is that with this legislation coming up, is that maybe one thing the staff could do is pull that testimony back out and edit it up a little bit, and we can send it with our resolution, that individuals can send that testimony to council people in advocating for this legislation, because it was so particular, it was great examples, and it's a way of, it gets the people who came to our meeting attention, it sets up the board to be a place where people come, and we're able to sort of move their ideas and information into a more authoritative place. So that's my thought. And I have some specific suggestions, but I'm going to send them, well, I'll say what they are, so if people object, they can also tell John Paul. But one is to focus on this the transparency, that we need to understand people are getting money, what kind of services are being provided for homeless students, and to sort of say something about that we have to assure, what everybody else is saying, assure that the transportation is guaranteed. And one thing I just want to add informationally is I do think that as these homeless shelters get put up in the wards, my own sense is not that there is very much attention to putting these shelters where there is transportation, and not very much attention to making sure the kids who are in them are going to have transportation. So I think that, I'm not saying to put it in here, but I think it's going to be a continuing, it's going to be a different problem, but it's going to be the same problem.
I think my concern is less that the shelters aren't near transportation, because I can only speak for the one in Ward 6. It's right next to the Green Line, so it's going to be really convenient. What I'm more concerned about is that my hunch is that there's no coordination between the folks who are placing families in shelters to say, oh look, you're near the Green Line. Does your child attend school in Anacostia or Congress Heights? Fantastic. This might be a worthwhile place for us to place you. Now, if you change your child's placement during the course of your time in the shelter, this is, you know, your responsibility. But I'm not necessarily convinced that there's that kind of strategy.
Some of it may also be that wherever there's an open space, right? Which is also.
But it could be a criteria, you know, it would be helpful, because I do think it's going to be a big help. All right, moving on, are we ready? Okay, on to Zachary and the equity statement.
Yes, I'm actually going to recommend that we truncate this. So we started this conversation at the retreat. We didn't get to the spirit of the part where we were reflecting on what parts of the equity statement we thought we were green, yellow, or red, green being strong, red being not so strong. So I wanted us to engage there, and as homework, and I'll follow up in email, then have people bring to in preparation for our next working group, so not the public meeting, recommendations for adaptations, enhancements, additions, subtractions to said equity statement. Make sense? Okay. So I know I'm going to recommend that we time this for like 10 minutes, in part also because I have to run to a community meeting. You have the equity statement in your folders. I will give everyone 60 seconds to just review it again. And then when we come back together, just so you know what we're going to do, we're going to talk about, I'm going to chunk it and I'll read it out. And then I would love for people to just weigh in. Do you think we're green, yellow, or red on that statement? Again, green being, yes, that was a slam dunk for us, and these are the bodies of work that connect to it. Or red, no, we didn't even discuss or touch that. And then why? And I'm going to take notes on it. So 60 seconds. You're reading right now. Yes, and then we're going to come back and we're going to chunk it to green, yellow, red.
Which things are important
Not important, but things we focused on.
that we have in the last year?
Yes. just be a bit more specific about the rating. So green, our work over the last year has fully met the description of that statement. Yellow, our work is in progress as it relates to that statement. Or red, we have not initiated or focused on any work that connects to that statement. So that's our rating. So the first statement is essentially the equity statement. I'm just chunking it for us. The DC State Board of Education defines equity in education as ensuring that every student, inclusive of race, religion, gender, and gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic standing, immigration status, and disability status, has the supports and resources to be successful in school. So, and let's make this a discussion.
Why do we have, why can't we just say every student has this? I don't think we should.
Had this discussion.
But we're already
In our strategy session. We had this
This is not
discussion
just
in our.
Yes. But
But you don't want us to edit, you want us to ask.
the homework is going to be around the edits because the push was, since we were in retreat, we couldn't have an official conversation around where we were. And so this is a moment for us as a board to just get a bit reflective as you all, for homework, think about, based on those conversations and reflections, these are the changes I would want to see to the state.
So I would rate this one as yellow. I think that we have talked around some of these issues in deeper topics we've gone in on, but I do not think we have focused on the question of how equitable is our work and how equitable is this for students.
Do you mind sharing any, not to put you on the spot any more time, but what parts of our work or conversations or anything that you think do connect?
So I'll say like the second broken out paragraph, I think we have focused on academic and non-academic measures in the STAR framework. That's a lot of the discussion of our research committee. We're talking a lot about the measures. We've talked with ASI about school climate surveys. We've talked with ASI about growth measures. So I think that I would rate green because we have focused specific work on it. But equity for students is a huge part of that. And I don't think we've spent the time digging in on, given what the data tells us, now what? What do we do? We talked a lot about, is the STAR rating a good thing or not a good thing? Should we have a dashboard instead? Should we be? And I think for me, this is the piece that is missing. We are not digging in on, but what does this mean for students' outcomes? And how do we talk about, I think we can say, we do not have equity in education in the district, but what are we doing about it?
I'm having sort of a hard time with this one because I'm trying to think of. Sorry, did I cut you? No. I guess so I can think of several times where we, even these, resolutions, addressing barriers for homeless kids, sorry, children, barriers for children who need teachers to look like them. And then I think when we talked about teacher attrition, we talked about the equity aspects of that. So would it make it green or, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe I need to think more deeply about what that would look like, what the green would look like. So maybe I am more yellow at this point.
And a part of this is to make the implicit explicit. It is my desire and hope that we can do a better job of coming back to the statement. It is my understanding that our colleagues that preceded us, and Jessica, put a lot of work into making this statement and creating it. And so how can we come back to it to make the living framework, and exactly that, a framework for our work versus what we heard tonight. Some people's view is that we're kind of being reactionary when maybe this could be a framework for how we decide our agenda or things we do take.
I mean, I'm leaning towards green just because I think this is true, and I'm curious to sort of think again more deeply about it. But I think it's true that most issues that we address we address the equity component in it. If it's not direct, you know what I mean? So I think that we do that.
So I, on the first paragraph, I was gonna say something similar to Emily, which is that I think what we should be doing is identifying our priority issues based on their effect on equity. And I think I think we've done a good job of identifying those issues. I think what sometimes we may not talk about enough, so that people understand it, is to talk, when we talk about them, to talk about them in that context. So that when we talk about our teacher attrition work, that the reason we have undertaken it with such energy is because of the disproportionate impact that it has on our high poverty neighborhoods and schools.
So you would rate that?
Well, I mean, I would rate it, I guess, a green minus or a yellow plus. You know, I mean, I think.
Such an indecisive.
Gosh, I don't think that was indecisive. I think that was
Green
totally
minus?
precise. Totally precise. Oh wait, I have one other thing.
Oh.
On the second paragraph.
We haven't gotten to the second chart. So I'm gonna take.
Are we on the first
Yep.
paragraph? Oh, okay.
We're not even in the first
Just
period.
talk about the second
The
paragraph.
first.
That was contrasting.
The first chunk, and then we're gonna move on.
Okay, since this was the advertisement when we put this together, I still have a problem with the defining equity, because even with these words in the first paragraph, they're not necessarily equitable. The outcomes from whatever you consider equitable may not be equitable. In other words, it's saying that everybody should have inclusive of race, blah, 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 the gender, their sex, whatever, has the supports and resources to be successful in school. How do you guarantee that? How do you ensure that? Okay? And how do you look at that?
Is your critique, are you saying that you don't think it's realistic?
I think it's, yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for that. We're going to move to the second time, and I'm sensitive to time. The second chunk, which is still the first paragraph, but this latter part, it reads, "We believe these supports and resources must be child-centered, evidence-based, and reflective of the social, emotional, and academic needs of the student." Where would you say we've been, green, yellow, red, and why?
I think we're green. Because we believe it. No, I'm serious. You're talking about a definition that's, and you're saying that, you know, the definition of cold is 31 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. That's the fact. But if you're talking about what we believe, I think that's green.
And do you think it's been reflected in our work?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I think to the extent we can monitor, you know,
No, it's just a belief.
Monitoring
Next
the next
paragraph.
paragraph.
Yeah, the next paragraph.
Well, I will say our belief of at least evidence-based approach to solutions, I would rate this chunk personally yellow. I think there are aspects, so evidence-based, for
So can I just
instance.
say, if you would vote for that dyslexia resolution, we'd be in a much better place.
Perhaps. But I was gonna say, I definitely think we've been evidence-based. It seems like the majority of our work and many of our discussions have centered around research and evidence. I feel really green there. I'm not always, I'm not as clear, and I truly do believe all of my colleagues or you all are child-centered, and I believe for the most part our work, even if it's not directly anchored on that, gets back at that. We have not, in my opinion, done a lot around social, emotional, or like the academic portions of policy standards. Well, yeah, that's a good one. And so that's why I say.
That's why I said we believe that.
Any other thoughts before we move on? A few more and then we're gonna wrap. Third chunk, which is essentially the entire second paragraph. Progressing toward the goal of success for every student and reducing disparities will include monitoring student progress on standardized assessments and relevant academic and non-academic measures included in the SS Star framework report cards? Or
Yeah,
can you say more?
Yeah, I could say a whole lot, because I don't think that progressing toward the goal of success for every student and reducing disparities. See, all it mentions there are like standardized tests. You got this vague, relevant academic and non-academic measures. I don't know what that means.
So, question, and maybe this is
We're
appropriate.
talking about the star.
Do you think we've monitored student progress via assessments at all this year? Discussed this, looked at reports? No. Do you think we've looked at anything related to the STAR framework for the report cards?
You know, if you think about it, no.
Okay.
Well, the return card we have.
We've looked at it, we haven't really talked about the report card this whole year.
We talked about how kids perform on it. We haven't talked about changing it, but this is about monitoring student progress on assessments of their reports.
We haven't, I mean, just talking about it. Just talking about it, that means.
Monitoring it.
See, it says progressing toward the goal of success for every student and reducing disparities.
I'm looking at the verbs, which is monitoring or monitoring student progress. I would agree with you that we're not getting towards success for every child just yet, but we are monitoring.
But we haven't monitored standardized assessment.
With the data
I
from
guess
that?
when, I mean, do you think, the way I understand it is like, for instance, when Ossie comes and presents to us, that is a way that we are, because we are learning.
Well, if you say that when console speed reads the results.
No, not that, I mean like here.
No, I'm serious. I mean, you know, like,
When they
we're talking
come
about.
and present to us, they're doing their job
No, I
under.
know that, but we're not,
It's very thorough.
but we're not, but it's really not a single conversation.
Sorry.
Would you say green here?
Yes, I'd say green and
It's not a two,
Now
it's not,
green.
I don't think it's a conversation, I think they're telling us information.
Well, because, no, it's a conversation. They're required to report to us. They're doing their job and we ask questions. At any time, you're more than welcome to email them if you have further questions. And I've reached out to them on numerous occasions and had to.
That's fine.
One more comment here, and then we're gonna take one more and then wrap.
No, I was just gonna say I have used the information that we've gotten from those presentations, that, like even a shape or like,
And
yeah,
I
so.
think, I just think it's very disingenuous to say that they read through things because I think they do a good job at their job. And I just don't.
I hear what you're saying, I just don't know what that has to do with progressing toward the goal of success.
Well,
But I will also
that's
say
all right.
we
That's
are,
just my opinion.
we
The
are
data
going-
guy at the table thinks we could do a lot more talking about student data and monitoring and benefit from it. So I think that's what Fraser's saying. We could spend more time doing it.
Yeah.
Put more.
I will say that we have two working groups, right, that are, the standards one actually is looking at, I mean, it's a very small pool, right, but we are going to look at that. And
I
then
don't know if
will
we're. Yes.
And I would say that the new one, that's, you know, the research one, is looking at the STAR framework and sort of taking what we've heard and what we've learned from Ossie and what we're learning from our stakeholders on our board and blah, blah, blah. That's the idea. So I think that's a way of monitoring. I would give us a green on.
Okay.
Can I just say, I mean, I actually think Emily has good examples that we are looking at these different aspects of the academics, but I think framing this so that part of our job is the monitoring doesn't make sense to me because we don't have any ability to monitor. It's not what's going on our.
We have the data. It's about what you do with it.
We can look at it, monitoring.
But that's, I mean, yeah. Anyway, for the
But
sake
then I
of
guess what I would say, if this is what you're asking, is if you ask me what's the best use of our time, it would not be monitoring, it would be doing.
Fair.
more,
Fair.
you know,
Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm gonna table it and stop it there. Again, as a next step, what I will do is I'll blast this statement out to you all and ask that you bring to our next working session, any additions, changes to the statement. Yeah, well,
We couldn't, right?
the purpose is more for us, this in one, be a living document, but two, what I think, or living statement rather, what I think is coming from our conversation is, board members have varying perspectives around like how we engage in this statement and if we are at all. And so then the question I would then pose to you all in this body would be, is this just a statement for the sake of having an equity statement? Or do we want a statement that actually reflects the work and how we
So
approach
can I make a
our
suggestion,
business?
apart from the edits that we make? I mean, it seems to me that what we need is not fixing that statement, but a set of subsequent questions that would be maybe things that we ask each time we take on a new project or something we ask at the end of the year. To what extent, is this project helping the city to focus on these equity needs? And at the end of the year, be able to say, give ourselves some grade. I mean, I don't think fixing the statement solves the problem. I mean, it's our job. The way to keep it living is that as we take on things, we should be thinking about this. And so, if there's a way to create kind of a tool that goes after that.
I added that as the next step.
Can I piggyback on that? I think I'm thinking back to my teaching years at Mission Hill, and we use our mission statement all the time. And we
Great
don't-
organizations usually do.
Yes, and we don't use this all the time, and I'm just realizing that maybe we should be reversing this process to some extent, so that when we consider something, we look at this and we revise it based on whether or not we're able to apply it or not.
That's exactly the hope. That is exactly the hope.
So
So is the conversation now broadening to include our vision and mission statement, which are separate from this?
No, I was using that as an example. No. So I'm just saying to use this in the same way that we used our mission statement.
I agree.
So just
Thank you.
to stamp next steps, we will come up with a list of questions. I will say I think it's connected to the statement itself, and so I do see the revisions as necessary if there are any, as well as those guiding questions or framework for our future work, and that will be on the agenda for our next working session.
All right. Committee reports. Teacher retention, I assume we're done with that? Is that
Yes.
okay? Social studies?
Hi. So social studies. 3 important things to know. 1, I spent Friday and Saturday at the Mid-States Council for the Social Studies meeting in Towson, Maryland. It was definitely a teacher-focused event. So the biggest wins I would say I took away from the conference, and which John Paul has thoughtfully invited me to write a blog post about, so I can share in more detail with the wider world what I learned. I had a wonderful time getting to chat with folks from DC who were at the conference. So Scott Abbott from DCPS and Donna Phillips from DCPS, Michael Stevens from Friendship, and then several DCPS teachers, including our National History Teacher of the Year, Alicia Butler from McKinley Tech. My conversation with Ms. Butler was great. She was on a panel of Gilda Lerman Teachers of the Year, and listening to her talk about, 1, the process of applying for this honor, but also the work and she did in reflecting on her lessons and how her sort of philosophy of teaching, specifically philosophy of teaching history, specifically philosophy of teaching history and whose stories are often not told in the standards and curriculum, was hugely influential. So you'll see more about that in my blog, but that was huge. What I want to make sure I'm clear with though on the committee is that it was not a good opportunity to learn as much as we thought we might be able to from other states about the revision processes, simply because some of those folks were not in the room. But the folks who I did meet from other states at the conference, I think will be good resources to get in touch with the right people. So that's one thing. Second thing is, at our last social studies committee meeting, we talked about our advisory committee. This is a group that the state board will convene to try to advise us on what's good about the current standards, what is missing, needs to be added, etc., what the process ought to look like, and ultimately will offer advice to those writing the standards, that being OSCE's responsibility, and then ideally being involved in an iterative feedback process between the advisory committee and those writing the standards before making recommendations to the state board about to adopt. So I've made revisions that we discussed in the committee meeting, and I will share those out with all members. We have our next committee meeting on March 25th after our public meeting. And at our public meeting, and this is the other really exciting thing I get to share with the committee, at our public meeting, we have a group of students who are coming to testify to us about their experiences with social studies. Sarah Arrington sent to me a list today. We have 2 students from Black Swan Academy, 2 students who participated in the We the People program, 1 student advisory committee member who plans to testify. We don't have numbers yet, but there's an expectation of a student who's participated in National History Day, students from Pathways to Power, students from One World Education, Make the Challenge, and students who are Laura Fuchs's students at Woodson. So we're very excited. We expect to have maybe up to 15 students. We do not expect that students will all talk the entire time, as many of our experts often do, but I'm sure we'll all have rich conversation with the students. So that's what I've got to offer. Happy to answer any questions now or over email.
That's the 25th.
Our next committee meeting is the 25th. The students are coming on the 18th to our public meeting.
Yeah, it should be great.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be wonderful.
All right, well-rounded education.
No, just kidding.
Combine the two.
What's that? Yeah, we have 2
Divide it
different,
into-
there's
2 different work streams,
research
one
projects.
committee, and so for the standards research, which is we've contracted officially with TNTP. They issued a formal proposal which committee members reviewed. We've since had 2 stakeholder meetings. One we called a state agency stakeholder meeting where representatives from OSSI, DME, the charter board, et cetera, attended. And then we had what we called a representative stakeholder meeting where folk from Focus and PAVE and WTU and Empower Ed were invited. They reviewed the proposals from TNTP and gave feedback. And so right now where we are in the process is working to identify or solidify rather the schools that will be part of the research. Just to remind you, we're working to investigate a representative sample of schools in the district to see how they are providing second grade students access to grade level instruction in literacy. The idea right now is that that would consist of 4 DCPS schools, 4 charters, and we are still in the works of trying to solidify that group based on getting green lights from different people. So as we get more information, which hopefully will come over the next month, we will update you on those schools. And the work, the visits will likely get started by the end of this month, early next month, and fingers crossed the report and work would be finished by May, end of May.
So well-rounded education, access to, that's what we said. It's access to well-rounded education, always remember at the end, is looking at the degree to which schools, when I say schools, the teachers in them and the teacher leaders feel that they are able to provide students with a well-rounded education, and we're defining that as being able to, give ample time and resources to subjects outside of the testing subjects. And so we're starting this with, so we started already with the collection of what they say they're doing, and so that's sort of ongoing. But the part that is in process now, the RFP has gone out for a survey, which has become sort of absorbed into a larger teacher survey, asking a lot of different questions, but the well-rounded education questions are embedded in there. So that RFP has gone out, and we're waiting to hear back, right? From now, what's at OCP?
It is currently at OCP.
Oh, right. Okay. But you feel like I already reported this.
It's been a little while.
Yeah.
So OCP. So this is the one where we also wanted some input from potential vendors prior to the solicitation process. And so OCP, Ruth and I were able to meet with some of the senior staff at OCP, and they suggested that if it is allowable, and they suggested that we send out the draft SOW to potential vendors and ask them to provide comment on it. And use their expertise on that. It is certainly not something that we would then use every single comment to sort of craft our final statement of work. But the idea is to have conversations with potential vendors about, is this doable? Is this not doable? Is this the right thing? Because part of what we have learned in our process is the contracting process is not designed for research, and so that is not how this works well. And so if we can sort of go on the front end of the contracting process to work with potential vendors or talk with them at least about how would you phrase this so that we can get what we want out of the process. So I'm hopeful that conversation and that process will happen within the next week so that we can move it forward.
Yeah, and that is a really important step forward. So thank you to you for.
We're trying. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it has now been at OCP for the last 2 weeks for this part of that process.
Right, I wasn't saying that
So
was
it
a
is-
step forward.
yeah.
I meant the fact that we can
Yeah.
now make this.
We are working.
Yeah.
We are working to move this forward. It is the challenge.
Right, but the idea is that once we do move forward, that we do have a vendor, that this survey will go out and we can learn from teachers and.
Yeah, I think especially.
principals.
I mean,
Yeah.
it will. I think it will certainly result in a better statement of work, and I think that's really important for us.
And specifically that we can contract with people based on the quality that they present and their experience. We don't just have to take the bottom.
Lowest cost of area.
Let me just say one quick thing about them. It's just, Emily mentioned the broader survey, and you'll remember this from previous conversations, is that there's a broader survey that's all teachers, partly about retention issues, where are you staying, so the flip side of what we just did. Plus, it'll be a set of questions about other things that we can still, people should think about other things that we want to ask, because we'll have some space to do that. Questions on either of these comments? All right, moving right along. On the research committee, you guys have 3 things that you got. One is the timeline, one is the draft for a kind of. This is very close to what we want to send out to the researchers. And it is asking these people, what is their view of different growth metrics? How do ours stack up? To what extent do our scores correlate with socioeconomic status? Something that we've seen a lot out there about.
Just to clarify, yeah, this is tired thing, no. These questions are intended for researchers who may already have done research that they can just share with us to respond to this. It's not necessarily like questions that guide research that would be done, right?
Well, mainly. I mean, some of them are local researchers who have, in fact, we know, gone through and have access to our local data, so that's what they would be doing. And then some are more national researchers who have just a huge amount of background and knowledge on measurement and ratings and stuff.
Can I make a recommendation? That we table this, invite everyone to the next committee meeting, which I know we're still scheduling.
Well, it's next week. I think it's on Thursday. So what I would suggest is.
We set that?
I definitely don't have that date.
Yeah,
I can't
I don't
make
have that
Thursday.
Wait, John Paul told me a date that most people. can make.
Tuesday is the date where most people can go, but Zachary, you're unavailable for the times that are available.
Well, I would just say, I would encourage, for the sake that this meeting is drawn on,
Right.
and I do not want to run out early, and so that's why I was hoping.
Well, what I would like to say, I'm gonna raise the one thing that was, there was a lot of discussion on, and people can comment on it, and they can comment on other stuff, and we'll bring it back up at the meeting, is whether or not, there's been a lot of discussion in different settings about the effect of certain rating systems on encouraging and discouraging parental choice in ways that leads to greater segregation of schools. And so I think some of us have an interest in posing that to some of these researchers to say, to what extent do you think that is happening here? And some people don't think that. are worried about conflating these issues of the measurement and the effect on segregation. So I think that's the question. And so I think the question is either to pose it in a way that's not leading or not to pose it at all. But I personally, I would just say my view is to ask it and see what we get because it's out there. But not everybody's for it, and it's not.
Are we trying to make that decision?
Well, I want people to think about it and they can respond. They don't have to respond here if they want to. They can respond.
Is there a deadline for?
Well, we're meeting on, what did we say, Tuesday? We're meeting on Tuesday, and that's the day we should decide.
So here's what I'll offer, because I was strongly opposed to this question. This is question 5 that's in
And I
italics.
rewrote it somewhat. So
Honor,
just to say.
I'm still strongly opposed to it. Partly because the great schools rating is not a state accountability system rating. And the research that was done on it, it's a journalistic piece by Matt Barnum and Chappie, specifically gets at the fact that it's ubiquitous. It's used by Zillow, it's used by Redfin, it's actually on real estate websites with houses along with what schools are zoned to those houses. So that conflates with state accountability ratings, which are not these great schools ratings. My other concern, and I raised this with Ruth, is that we have a huge issue of school segregation in our city. I think that's an issue that the state board ought to be talking about. Do not think that tying it to the star rating does justice to the fact that families make choices about schools based on housing. They make choices about schools based on race. And they make these choices as a product of privilege. Oftentimes, white families are making choices based on issues of privilege and trying to choose schools where their students will not be in the minority. So I sent a link around for a podcast in which Matt Barnum talks with 2 parents from the Integrated Schools podcast and the Integrated Schools organization about the research. I would really encourage folks to listen to it, but I just want to read this quote from Matt Barnum that really stands out as to my concern. He says, there's a question of how elastic, how malleable are family school choices, and to what extent is grade schools helping families choose a school versus supporting pre-existing choices that would already happen. Are families using race or are they using test scores? Or are they using race but pretending to use test scores? Our conception of what a good school is so wrapped up in both race and test scores that are highly correlated with each other. My concern is that this question doesn't get into the complexity of that and wouldn't help us build a better tool of state accountability. I think there are issues about how our state accountability system fails to correct for biases, and I think we ought to tackle that head on. I think we should spend
that question.
I think we should spend our money and our resources on that and not conflate issues of race, class, privilege, school segregation, parental choices based on privilege and bias with our rating system. I want us to fix our rating system. I want us to take into account all the feedback we're getting from folks on what's wrong with the rating system. This worries me because it conflates not a state accountability system, great schools, with our rating system and tries to put the problems of that rating system on ours while failing to account for some of these more
Let me just to
complicated
clarify,
issues.
I'm just going to say one sentence on it. Is the point is not to conflate our rating system with grade schools, but to say here's a set of concerns about rating systems. To what extent should we worry about this with our rating system? That's
But
all. I mean,
this set of concerns is about grade schools, a specific rating system, not our
there's
rating
other.
system.
I mean, I can put. There's.
Which rating, you're saying rating system in general.
Yeah. To what extent do we know that rating systems end up having this driving effect? That's all. I mean, I just thought it would be if we're paying people who are experts, we should ask them that because it's come up at a lot of meetings. It's not. I mean, it's going to come up whether we ask the question or not. That's all. But I think that Jessica's basic point I don't disagree with, which is the first question and the fundamental question is the extent to which the rating system does, for different reasons, end up being biased in some way because of socioeconomic status of the students. And if that's a problem, we need to know it's a problem. If it's not a problem, we don't, then we know it's not a problem.
Does it also have to do with definition of quality?
So I'm going to interject and say these are wonderful conversations that should be had in committee. We've spent now 20 plus minutes on this, and I don't think this is the place for it.
All right, well, we've had it in the committee, we're going to have it again in the committee. I wanted to give people a chance to comment between you. So if you have comments, please send them in. And the research committee will be talking about this again, hopefully finalizing some on Tuesday, and that's it.
Real quick, I think we should discuss setting time limits to meetings and discussion topics, and actually instituting those. I sit on a couple different boards, and I believe Roberts has some overarching discussion on how to run that. Where a meeting is set, you have 10 minutes to discuss. There's somebody who has a timer and says at that time all discussion stops. You have to make a motion to increase 2 minutes of time, extra time from now on. We're going into 3.5 hours for a working session, and our last meeting lasted almost 4 hours.
So I don't, can I just say, we meet so little, we have so much to talk about, so I think we should talk about that, but I think it's an issue. On both ends, I think it's an issue. And we try to do more in the committees, but then we wanna bring it here, so why don't you propose something next time? You wanna do
I
that?
think she did.
I will propose something specific.
I will make a suggestion online, yes, and we can talk about that.
Is there a time that the meetings usually, is it like 2 hours, 3 hours?
2 hours is normally
But they're open.
projected time.
We're just doing so much work.
All right.
This board is correct.
What is this thing?
What? So you want this?
Are we adjourning?
What is this?
Yeah,
What is
okay,
this?
are we adjourning any new business? All right.
What is this thing?
What?
This State Board of Education work that says,
I think that's just
new
no.
prep public notice.
These were public testimony we received from members of the public raising concerns.
Oh.
So
Oh,
when
that's in our,
we receive written testimony, it automatically becomes record for our next public meeting, and this is the next public meeting for that.
Oh, okay.
and as people are going, if you wanna be part of the reading letter, please let me know. If you wanna be part of it, but you want a lot of changes, let me know. If you don't wanna be part of it and you want me to know that so I don't bother you, let me know. And that's all I have to say.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.